Hello, story seekers. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. I've always been drawn to quiet, out-of-the-way places. Growing up, I had this peculiar fascination with old buildings, places that carried the weight of history in their creaking floorboards and weathered walls. It wasn't unusual for me to plan weekend getaways to quaint, remote towns just to soak in the charm of a forgotten era. That's exactly what brought me to the Ash Grove Inn, a modest hotel nestled in a sleepy town you wouldn't find on most maps. It was the end of fall, that time of year when the air turns crisp and the leaves blanket the streets in fiery hues. I had just wrapped up a particularly grueling project at work, so I decided to treat myself to a quiet weekend away. My friend, Tom, tagged along, a laid-back guy with a knack for finding humor in even the dullest moments. He wasn't as enamored with the charm of old buildings as I was, but he was always up for an adventure. The Ash Grove Inn stood at the edge of town, its Victorian architecture standing out against the otherwise nondescript backdrop. It wasn't a grand building by any means, but it had a certain presence: tall windows, intricate woodwork, and a turret that seemed oddly out of place for a structure its size. The front desk clerk, an older man with thinning hair and a voice like gravel, greeted us warmly. He handed us a key with a small, tarnished tag reading, Room 5. "Room 5, huh?" Tom said with a smirk. "Sounds like the setting for a horror movie." I rolled my eyes. "You've got quite the imagination, Tom." The room itself was as unremarkable as the rest of the inn: neatly made bed, worn carpet, and a faint smell of lavender that seemed to cling to everything. The walls were adorned with faded floral wallpaper, and a small wooden desk sat by the window overlooking the quiet street below. It was perfect for what I needed: peace, quiet, and a break from the chaos of daily life. The first evening passed uneventfully. We wandered the town, ate at a charming little diner, and returned to the room to watch a few episodes of a show neither of us particularly cared about. As the clock struck midnight, we decided to call it a night. The next morning, over a breakfast of pancakes and coffee in the hotel's modest dining area, we struck up a conversation with one of the staff members, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Carter. She had the kind of friendly demeanor that instantly put you at ease. When we mentioned our plans to explore the town, she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You boys staying in room 5? She asked. "Yes," I replied, puzzled by her sudden shift in tone. Her eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place: concern, perhaps, or hesitation. "That room has a bit of history," she said. "Nothing too alarming, but, well, you might hear some stories from the locals. Don't pay them any mind. Old buildings like this tend to collect their share of ghost tales." Tom chuckled. "Ghosts, huh? Adds to the ambience." Mrs. Carter smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just remember, if you hear anything unusual, it's probably just the wind." The rest of the day was uneventful. We strolled through the town, visited a small antique shop, and spent some time at a nearby park. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, we made our way back to the inn. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake Mrs. Carter's words. "If you hear anything unusual, it was probably just small-town folklore," I told myself. After all, every old building comes with its share of ghost stories, right? With that thought, I turned over and drifted off to sleep. It must have been around 2 o'clock when I woke up to the sound of knocking. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the moonlight streaming through the curtains. At first, I thought it was just part of a dream, the kind of hazy disorientation that comes from being pulled too quickly out of sleep. But there it was again, 3 sharp knocks, deliberate and steady. "Tom," I muttered groggily, assuming he was the one making the noise. My voice barely carried in the stillness of the room. What? Tom's voice came from the other bed, muffled and annoyed. Did you say something? I blinked, now fully awake. You didn't hear that? Hear what? He asked, turning over to face me. The faint outline of his figure in the dark told me he wasn't playing around. The knocking, I said, sitting up in bed. It came from the door. Tom sighed. You probably dreamed it. Go back to sleep. But I was certain I hadn't imagined it. The sound had been too crisp, too real. I waited, my ears straining against the silence, but the room remained unnervingly quiet. Finally, I got up, shuffled to the door, and peered through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. No one's there, I said, returning to bed. Tom didn't respond. He was already half asleep again. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me as I lay back down. The following morning, I told Tom about the knocking again, but he just laughed it off. It's an old building, he said between bites of toast. Probably the pipes or something. Mrs. Carter, who had been refilling the coffee station nearby, glanced in our direction. For a brief moment, her face froze, her cheerful expression replaced by something darker. She quickly masked it with a polite smile, but the way her hands trembled as she set down the coffee pot didn't escape my notice. Everything all right with your room? She asked casually, though her tone betrayed a hint of anxiety. Yeah, I said, though my voice wavered slightly. Just heard some knocking in the middle of the night. Probably nothing. Mrs. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. Like I said yesterday, old buildings have their quirks. Don't let it bother you. Tom shot me a look that said, see? Nothing to worry about. I nodded, trying to convince myself she was right. After all, I didn't want to come across as the kind of guy who jumps at shadows. Still, something about her reaction made me feel like there was more to the story. The day went on without incident. We explored more of the town, chatting with locals and poking around in small shops. Everyone seemed friendly enough, though I couldn't shake the feeling that they were holding something back. There was a subtle awkwardness whenever we mentioned we were staying at the Ash Grove Inn. Especially when room 5 came up, a few people exchanged nervous glances. One older man even muttered, "They still rent that one out?" under his breath before walking away. When we returned to the inn that evening, the atmosphere felt heavier, though I couldn't pinpoint why. The same dim lighting, the same creaking floors, it was all as it had been the day before, but the air carried an inexplicable weight. As we settled in for the night, I tried to push my unease aside. Tom had already sprawled out on his bed, scrolling through his phone and laughing at something on the screen. I figured I was just letting local gossip get to me. Around midnight, the knocking came again. This time, it was louder, more insistent, 4 quick raps, followed by a pause, then another 3. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Tom groaned. "Okay, now I heard it," he said, throwing the covers off and sitting up. "What the hell?" He flipped on the bedside lamp, casting a warm glow across the room. We both stared at the door, neither of us moving. The knocks came again, and this time, I swear I felt the vibrations in the floor beneath my feet. Tom grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. "All right, this is getting ridiculous," he said, heading for the door. "Wait," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I wasn't sure why, but the idea of opening the door filled me with dread. Maybe we should call the front desk. "Call the front desk for what?" Tom shot back. "It's probably just some drunk guest messing around." He unlocked the door and pulled it open, his flashlight beam cutting through the dim hallway. Once again, there was no one there, just the same flickering bulb and a long stretch of carpeted floor. "See?" "Nothing," he said, though his tone lacked its usual confidence. We stood there for a moment, listening. The hallway was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Just as Tom was about to close the door, we both heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was faint, coming from somewhere down the hall, and though I couldn't make out the words, The sound sent a chill racing down my spine. Tom's flashlight flicked toward the direction of the whisper, but there was nothing there. He hesitated, then shut the door firmly, locking it with a definitive click. "All right," he said, his voice strained. That was weird. We stayed up for a while after that, neither of us saying much. Tom eventually fell asleep, but I couldn't. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside felt amplified, like the building itself was alive and watching. When morning came, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. Over breakfast, I noticed that Mrs. Carter avoided us entirely, her usual friendly demeanor replaced with a hurried efficiency. It was as if she didn't want to make eye contact, let alone talk to us. "Maybe we should check out," I suggested to Tom as we walked back to the room to pack. He shrugged. "Why?" "It's just a few weird noises. Don't let it get to you." But I could tell he wasn't as dismissive as he wanted to appear. There was a tension in his jaw, a tightness in his movements that hadn't been there before. He didn't want to admit it, but the events of the past 2 nights had gotten to him too. We decided to stay one more night, reasoning that leaving early would feel like giving in to whatever was happening. But deep down, I wasn't sure it was the right decision. Something about room 5, about the Ash Grove Inn itself, felt wrong, and I had the sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. That third night in room 5 began like the others, with a strange silence that seemed to seep through the walls. Tom and I spent most of the evening trying to distract ourselves. We played cards, scrolled through our phones, and even turned on an old TV mounted in the corner, though the static-ridden local channels didn't offer much comfort. Still, beneath the surface of our casual activities, there was an unspoken tension. Both of us were waiting for something to happen. The first strange event came earlier than usual, around 9:30 p.m. As I shuffled the deck for another round of cards, the overhead light flickered briefly, then buzzed faintly before stabilizing. Tom didn't even look up. "Old wiring," he muttered. But I wasn't so sure. The flickering wasn't random, it pulsed in a rhythm, like a heartbeat, and I could swear the buzzing sound wasn't just electrical hum. It had a strange, almost whispering quality to it, though I couldn't make out any words. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice hesitant. "Hear what?" Tom said, finally glancing up. "The buzzing. It sounded off." Tom shrugged, clearly trying to brush it off. "Probably just a loose connection. This place isn't exactly state-of-the-art." I nodded, though the unease in my chest didn't subside. We continued playing cards, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept darting toward the corners of the room, half expecting to see something lurking there. The shadows seemed darker tonight, heavier, as if they were pressing in on us. By 11 o'clock, the knocks returned. This time, they didn't come from the door. Instead, they echoed from the walls, 3 sharp raps, followed by a pause, then another set of 3. The sound was so distinct it made my skin crawl. "Okay, that's definitely not normal," Tom said, setting his cards down. He grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and scanned the walls. "Do you think there's something behind here? Like pipes or... I don't know, rats." "Rats don't knock," I said, standing up. My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I was too on edge to care. Tom frowned and tapped the wall with his knuckles. "It's solid," he said. "There's no way." Before he could finish, the knocks came again, this time directly behind him. He jumped, spinning around with the flashlight. I grabbed my phone and turned on its light, both of us scanning the room for any sign of an explanation. But the walls were just walls plain, slightly chipped paint over old plaster. Nothing out of the ordinary. "Let's check the hallway," Tom said, heading for the door. The hallway was empty, as it had been the night before. But this time, the flickering bulb at the far end seemed to cast shadows that didn't quite match the shapes of the furniture. I couldn't explain it, but there was something wrong with the light, like it was bending around the edges of the corridor in ways it shouldn't. Tom walked down the hall, his flashlight cutting through the dimness. I hesitated before following, the unease in my stomach twisting into full-blown dread. As we approached the flickering bulb, the whispers started again. This time, they weren't faint or distant. They were close, too close, as if someone was standing right next to me, breathing words I couldn't understand into my ear. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, clutching my phone tightly. Tom stopped in his tracks, his face pale. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, I hear it." The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and suddenly the bulb at the end of the hall shattered, plunging us into darkness. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. Tom swung the flashlight beam wildly, illuminating the now broken light fixture. The whispers stopped as abruptly as they had started, leaving only the sound of our breathing and the faint creak of the floor beneath our feet. "Let's go back to the room," Tom said, his voice shaking. I didn't argue. Once we were back inside room 5, we locked the door and pushed the dresser in front of it for good measure. Neither of us said much. What could we say? Something was happening, something neither of us could explain, and it was getting worse. As the night wore on, the strange events escalated. Around 1 o'clock, the bathroom sink turned on by itself. The sound of running water jolted us both out of our uneasy silence. Tom cautiously approached the bathroom, flashlight in hand. "It's just a faulty faucet," he said, though his voice was tight. He twisted the knob to shut it off, but as soon as he stepped back, the water turned on again. He stared at it, dumbfounded, then yanked the knob as hard as he could. This time, the water stopped for good, but the unease in the room seemed to thicken. Not long after that, the knocking returned, louder and more erratic than before. It seemed to come from everywhere: walls, ceiling, even the floor beneath us. At one point, it was so loud it drowned out our voices as we shouted over it, trying to make sense of what was happening. Tom grabbed his phone and started recording. "If we don't make it out of here," he joked nervously, "at least someone will know what happened." The knocking finally stopped around 3 o'clock, but the silence that followed was worse. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, as if the air itself was watching us. "I think we need to figure out what's going on here," I said finally. "We can't just sit around waiting for it to get worse." Tom nodded, though he looked reluctant. "All right," he said. "But where do we even start?" We decided to check the room for anything unusual. We pulled the beds away from the walls, lifted the carpet, and even opened the old wooden dresser. Nothing. But when Tom moved the nightstand, he froze. "Hey, come look at this," he said, pointing to the floor. Carved into the wooden floorboards beneath the nightstand was a series of strange symbols. They looked almost like letters, but not from any language I recognized. The lines were jagged, uneven, as if they'd been scratched into the wood by someone in a hurry or in desperation. "What the hell is this?" Tom muttered, crouching down to get a better look. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't think it's good." As we stared at the symbols, the room grew colder. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes it hard to breathe. Then, without warning, the overhead light flickered violently before going out completely, plunging us into darkness. The flashlight beams danced wildly as we scrambled to find the switch, but it was no use. The electricity was gone, and the room was silent except for the sound of our ragged breathing. And then, from the corner of the room, came the sound of a chair creaking. Both of us turned, our flashlights landing on the old wooden chair that sat by the window. It was empty at least. It looked empty, but it was rocking gently, as if someone had just stood up from it. Neither of us moved. We just stood there, frozen, as the chair rocked back and forth, the creaking sound filling the room. My hand tightened around the flashlight, and for a moment I thought about running. But where would we go? Outside, into the hallway that now felt just as threatening as the room itself. Tom was the first to speak. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. I nodded, but as we gathered our things and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. And as we stepped into the hallway, I realized the whispers had started again, faint but unmistakable, following us as we made our way toward the stairs. The night of the climax felt different from the start. The air in room 5 was thicker, heavier, as if the very walls were bracing themselves for something monumental. Tom and I hadn't slept properly in days, and the strain was evident in our sunken eyes and the tremor in our voices. Every attempt to leave the motel had failed. The car wouldn't start. Our phones lost signal whenever we reached the lot, and even the front desk seemed to vanish in the darkness of the night. That night, the knocking began early, not from the walls or the floor, but from the window. 3 sharp taps, followed by an unnatural silence, as though the world outside had been swallowed whole. "Don't," I said sharply as Tom moved toward the window, flashlight in hand. He stopped, his hand frozen midair. "You think it's out there?" he whispered, though his voice cracked under the weight of his fear. "I don't know," I replied, my own voice barely audible. "But whatever it is, it's getting bolder." Tom nodded and backed away, but his eyes were fixed on the dark window, as if expecting it to shatter at any moment. The taps came again, louder this time, almost demanding attention. I gripped the flashlight tighter, the cold metal grounding me as my heart raced. Before either of us could decide what to do, the overhead light flickered violently, casting jagged shadows across the room. And then it came a sound that didn't belong in this world. A guttural, otherworldly groan that seemed to emanate from every corner of the room at once. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. "Do you feel that?" Tom gasped, clutching his chest. I nodded, unable to speak. The groan grew louder, morphing into a cacophony of whispers, screams, and something that sounded disturbingly like laughter. The dresser we'd pushed against the door began to rattle, its wooden legs scraping against the floor. "Is it trying to get in?" Tom shouted over the noise, his voice tinged with panic. "I don't know," I yelled back, but deep down, I suspected the truth. Whatever it wasn't outside, it was already here, and it wanted us to know. The room suddenly went silent, the kind of silence that amplifies every heartbeat, every breath. And then, in that stillness, the symbols we'd discovered beneath the nightstand began to glow. A faint, eerie blue light pulsed from the carvings, casting ghostly patterns onto the walls. "What the hell is this?" Tom whispered, his eyes wide as he stared at the glowing symbols. "I don't know, but it's not good," I said, taking a step back. The symbols grew brighter, their light flickering like flames. And then, in the center of the room, a shadow began to form. At first, it was faint, barely more than a ripple in the air. But it grew quickly, solidifying into a towering figure that seemed to suck the light from the room. It had no clear form, its edges were jagged and constantly shifting, like smoke caught in a windless room. But its eyes were unmistakable. 2 glowing orbs, brighter than the symbols on the floor, staring directly at us. I froze, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. Tom let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward until he hit the wall. "What? What is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The shadow didn't speak, but its presence was overwhelming. It moved slowly toward us, each step causing the air to grow colder, the walls to groan under some invisible pressure. "Get behind me," Tom said, his voice suddenly firm despite the fear in his eyes. He grabbed the flashlight, holding it out like a weapon. "It's not going to do anything," I said, though I didn't stop him. The shadow paused, its glowing eyes narrowing as if it understood us. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth, it spoke. "Why? Are you here?" The words were slow, deliberate, and filled with a malice that made my blood run cold. "We didn't mean to," Tom began, but the shadow cut him off with a growl that shook the room. "Your presence disturbs. We'll leave," I blurted out, my voice cracking. "We'll go right now. Just let us go." The shadow didn't respond immediately. Instead, it seemed to grow, its form towering over us until it felt like the room itself was alive with its darkness. "You cannot leave," it said finally. And then, with a speed that defied its massive form, it lunged. Tom screamed, swinging the flashlight wildly, but it passed through the shadow as if it wasn't there. The force of the attack sent him sprawling, the flashlight skittering across the floor. "Tom!" I shouted, rushing to his side. He was pale, his breathing shallow, but he was alive. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the shadow, though I knew it wouldn't do any good. "What do you want?" I yelled, my voice breaking. The shadow paused, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I thought I saw something in them: anger, yes, but also something deeper. Sadness? Regret? "You must see," it said, its voice softer now, almost pleading. Before I could ask what it meant, the room around us began to change. The walls faded, replaced by a swirling darkness that seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction. The floor beneath us disappeared, yet we didn't fall. Instead, we floated in the void, surrounded by flickering images that played like scenes from a movie. In one image, I saw a man carving the symbols into the floor, his face twisted in fear and desperation. In another, a group of people huddled in the corner of the room, their eyes wide as the shadow loomed over them. "What is this?" I whispered, unable to look away. "The past," the shadow said. "The truth." The images continued, each more horrifying than the last. I saw flashes of violence, terror, and despair, all centered around room 5. This wasn't just a motel room. It was a trap, a place where something unspeakable had happened, over and over again. When the images finally faded, we were back in the room, but it felt different now. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. "Why are you showing us this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "To end the cycle," the shadow said. Before I could ask what it meant, the symbols on the floor flared brightly, and the shadow began to dissolve, its form breaking apart like ash in the wind. As it disappeared, the room grew still. The oppressive presence was gone, but the weight of what we'd seen remained. Tom and I sat in silence for a long time, neither of us able to speak. When the first light of dawn crept through the window, we knew one thing for certain: we could never come back to room 5. The first rays of sunlight streaming through the window felt like salvation, piercing the darkness that had engulfed room 5. For the first time in days, the air was lighter, as though the room itself had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. Tom and I sat motionless on the floor, backs pressed against the bed frame, our bodies too drained to move. The symbols that had glowed with eerie intensity the night before were now nothing more than faint etchings on the wooden floor. The shadow was gone, dissolved into the air, leaving behind an unsettling stillness that seemed almost deafening. "Is it over?" Tom finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, though I wanted to believe it was. The absence of that oppressive presence felt like an answer, but the scars of the night lingered in every corner of the room and in us. We didn't waste time debating. Every instinct screamed at us to leave, to put as much distance as possible between us and room 5. The car, which had refused to start for days, roared to life on the first turn of the key, as though it, too, had been freed from the motel's grasp. Neither of us spoke as we sped away from the building. The twisted road that had once felt endless now seemed to stretch on forever, but we kept driving, our eyes darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting the shadow to follow. When we finally reached the nearest town, exhaustion hit us like a tidal wave. We pulled into the parking lot of a small diner, the comforting smell of coffee and grease wafting through the open door. Inside, the world felt normal again. Diners laughed over breakfast, a waitress refilled coffee cups, and the morning news played softly on a mounted television. But normalcy felt foreign now, almost cruel in its indifference to what we had just survived. Over 2 cups of steaming coffee, we tried to make sense of everything. The shadow, Tom said, stirring his cup absent-mindedly. It wasn't just evil. It wanted us to understand. I nodded, recalling the flickering images it had shown us. Those people, the ones in the past, they were trapped, just like us. And the symbols, they weren't just carvings. They were part of some ritual, some attempt to contain whatever that thing was. Tom's hands trembled slightly as he set his cup down. But why us? Why now? I didn't have an answer. Maybe we were just unlucky. Maybe we had stumbled into something ancient, something that didn't care about our lives or our questions. Later, when we mustered the courage to search online, we found threads and articles about the motel. Room 5 was infamous, its dark history whispered about in forums dedicated to the paranormal. Murders, disappearances, unexplained phenomena, it all led back to that room. One article caught our attention. The Curse of Room 5, a history of hauntings. It detailed the story of a man who had performed a ritual in that very room decades ago, carving symbols into the floor in a desperate bid to banish a malevolent spirit. But instead of banishing it, the ritual had trapped the entity, binding it to the room and ensuring it would prey on anyone who stayed there. They tried to stop it, Tom said, scrolling through the article. But they just made it worse. Maybe that's why it let us go, I said, the realization dawning on me. We saw the truth. It wanted us to know, to break the cycle. Even as we drove further away, the questions piled up. Had we truly ended the curse, or had the shadows simply released us because we were no longer useful? Were the other guests the ones we had heard but never seen real, or were they echoes of the room's tragic past? The thought that haunted me most was the shadow's final words, to end. The cycle. Had we ended it, or had we become part of it? We didn't have answers, and perhaps we never would. But one thing was certain. The motel, Room 5, and the shadow that dwelled there had left an indelible mark on us. The following days were a blur of sleepless nights and nervous glances over our shoulders. The shadow was gone, but its presence lingered in our minds, a phantom that haunted us in our quietest moments. Tom struggled the most. He became withdrawn, barely speaking and jumping at the slightest noise. One night, I found him staring at a blank notebook, the faint outline of the symbols from the room etched in pencil on the page. "You're drawing them?" I asked, my voice a mix of fear and anger. "I don't know why," he admitted, his voice hollow. "I can't stop thinking about them. It's like they're still there in my head." I grabbed the notebook and tore the page out, crumpling it into a ball. "You can't let it get to you, Tom. It's over. We're free." But were we? Weeks later, I found myself drawn back to the area. I didn't tell Tom. I knew he wouldn't understand. But something inside me needed to see it again, to confirm that it was real. The motel was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. A faded sign read, "No trespassing." I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where Room 5 had once stood. The air was quiet, the oppressive presence gone, but the unease in my chest remained. As I turned to leave, a strange thought struck me. The shadow had said we couldn't leave, yet here I was, alive and free. Maybe, just maybe, it had been telling the truth when it said we were the ones to end the cycle. But if that was true, why did I feel like it wasn't over? The experience in Room 5 changed us. It fractured something inside, leaving us both scarred in ways that would never fully heal. Tom and I eventually drifted apart, the shared trauma too much to bear together. I moved to another state, started a new job, and tried to rebuild my life. But some nights, when the wind howls just right, or the shadows in my room stretch a little too far, I hear it, the faint, guttural groan of something ancient and unspeakable. And I wonder, did we truly escape Room 5? Or is it still with us, waiting for the right moment to remind us that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed? The quiet hum of the city filled my ears as I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, the skyline illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights and distant neon signs. It had been months since Tom and I had fled from room 5, leaving behind more than just a cursed motel. We had left behind a piece of ourselves, a part that could never be recovered. I sipped from my coffee mug, its warmth steadying my hands, and let my mind wander back to those moments. The darkness of room 5 had been overwhelming, suffocating, but in the aftermath, what lingered wasn't just fear, it was a deep, gnawing curiosity. What had really happened in that room? And why had it chosen us? Tom and I hadn't spoken in weeks. After leaving the motel, we had tried to hold on to the connection that had once seemed unbreakable. But shared trauma has a way of building walls instead of bridges. Each conversation became strained, each meeting a reminder of the shadow that had stalked us. Eventually, we stopped trying. I often wondered how he was doing, whether he had found peace, or if the memories haunted him the way they haunted me. Late at night, when the shadows in my apartment shifted just out of sight, I would think of him. Was he seeing the same things I saw? In my free time, I dove into research, looking for any explanation that could bring clarity. I scoured obscure forums, read books on the occult, and even reached out to so-called experts in paranormal phenomena. The answers were as fragmented as my thoughts. Some claimed that the symbols in the room were ancient protection runes, meant to bind a spirit to a specific place. Others argued that they were a warning, a desperate attempt to keep people away. No one could agree on their origin, let alone their purpose. One theory stuck with me though. A forum user who went by the name Watcher91 suggested that the shadow wasn't inherently evil. It's an echo, they wrote, a fragment of something trapped between worlds. It's not trying to harm you, it's trying to escape. I didn't know if I believed that, but the idea gave me pause. If the shadow wasn't a malevolent force, but rather a trapped soul or an echo of something greater, had we done the right thing by fleeing? Or had we condemned it to remain in that cursed room, alone and desperate? I told myself I wouldn't return to the site of the motel, but the pull was too strong. On a cloudy afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the empty lot once more. The rusted chain-link fence was still there, its no trespassing sign swaying slightly in the wind. The weeds had grown taller, obscuring most of the space, but the outline of the building's foundation was still visible. For a long time, I just stood there, letting the memories wash over me. I thought about the flickering lights, the guttural groans, the oppressive darkness that had enveloped us. And I thought about the shadow, its final words still etched in my mind. To end. The cycle. Had we ended it? Or had we merely passed the burden on to someone else? I didn't step beyond the fence. I didn't need to. The air was different now, lighter, quieter. Whatever had held the motel in its grip was gone, or at least dormant. But the unease in my chest told me the story wasn't over. Driving away from the lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been chosen, not at random, but for a purpose. Maybe the shadow had needed us to understand its pain, its history, its imprisonment. Or maybe we were just two unlucky travelers caught in the crosshairs of something far beyond our comprehension. Back in my apartment, I sat down to write everything I could remember. The symbols, the voices, the flickering lights, I poured it all onto the page, as though documenting the experience could help me make sense of it. The process was cathartic, but it didn't bring the closure I had hoped for. Instead, it left me with a nagging question. If the shadow had truly been freed, where had it gone? A week later, I received an unexpected email from Tom. The subject line was simple. It's not over. My heart raced as I opened it. The message was brief, almost frantic. I've been seeing it, he wrote. Not every night, but often enough. The shadows, the groans, they're back. I think it followed me. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as my mind raced. Could the shadow really have attached itself to one of us? Was this the reason we had been spared, only to carry its presence with us like a curse? I replied immediately, asking Tom to call me, but days passed without a response. His silence only deepened my unease. The weeks turned into months, and life carried on, as it always does. The world didn't stop for two people haunted by a shadow from a forgotten motel. But in the quiet moments, when the city's noise faded and I was left alone with my thoughts, the memories resurfaced. I realized that some questions would never have answers, and some scars would never fully heal. The shadow, the symbols, the voices, they were all part of a story I would carry with me for the rest of my life. But I also realized something else. Fear doesn't have to control you. The shadow had tried to dominate us, to trap us in its cycle of terror. By leaving that room, by walking away, we had taken the first step toward reclaiming our lives. The shadows in my apartment still move sometimes. The wind still carries whispers that sound too deliberate to be random. And Tom's email still sits in my inbox, unanswered, a reminder that the past is never truly gone. But I'm still here. I'm still moving forward. And no matter what comes next, I know one thing for certain. Some doors are better left closed, but once they're opened, it's up to you to decide whether to step through or walk away. Let me take you back to the summer of 2010, a time when I was 24 years old and living in a quiet, Midwestern town that felt like it had been plucked out of an old postcard. Rows of neat houses lined the streets, and the local diner was always filled with the same friendly faces. I just moved back to town after a brief stint in the city, craving the familiar pace of life I'd grown up with. I was renting a small, one-bedroom house near the outskirts of town, not far from where I'd gone to middle school. My days were spent working a straightforward office job, and my evenings were mostly spent reading or watching old movies. Life was calm, maybe a little too calm. The one person who kept things interesting was my childhood friend, Ben. Ben and I had been inseparable since third grade. He was the adventurous type, always coming up with plans that teetered between bold and reckless. He was the kind of guy who'd suggest a midnight drive to nowhere or insist on hiking trails marked off limits. I was the quieter counterpart, usually the voice of reason, though I rarely turned down his ideas. Together, we found a balance. That summer, our favorite pastime was exploring the forgotten corners of our town. For such a small place, it had its share of abandoned buildings and hidden trails. It was something we'd done as kids, sneaking into old barns or climbing the water tower, and we never really outgrew it. One place, however, always stood out in our memories, the old Hawthorne School. Hawthorne School had been shut down for over 2 decades. It was a sprawling 2-story building made of red brick, with tall windows that had long since been boarded up or shattered. As kids, we dared each other to run up to its locked doors and knock, but we never got further than that. Back then, the local kids whispered stories about ghosts in its halls and shadows that moved on their own. Now, as adults, Ben and I joked about those childhood fears, but there was still something about the school that made me uneasy. It sat at the edge of town, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had rusted and sagged over the years. The overgrown yard was littered with broken desks, scraps of textbooks, and the occasional graffiti. It was the kind of place that looked like it held secrets, even in broad daylight. One warm evening in July, Ben brought it up. "We should go check out Hawthorne," he said casually, leaning back in his chair as we sat on my porch. I laughed, shaking my head. "You still think that place is worth exploring?" "It's just an old building." "Exactly. It's been sitting there all this time, and no one's gone in. Don't you want to know what's inside?" I shrugged, trying to play it cool, but a part of me was curious. The school had been part of our shared history, a looming presence in the background of our childhood. If nothing else, it would be a chance to revisit those memories. 2 days later, we stood outside the fence, flashlights in hand. The sun had just set, and the sky was a dusky purple. The air was thick with the scent of summer grass, and faintly humid. As I stared up at the school, I felt a familiar twinge of unease. "I don't know about this," I muttered. Ben grinned, already pulling back a section of the fence that had come loose. "Come on. What's the worst that could happen?" I followed him through the gap, my footsteps crunching softly on the gravel. The building loomed ahead of us, its windows dark and uninviting. For a moment, I was transported back to those days when we dared each other to get closer, my heart pounding with the same nervous excitement. Inside, the air was musty and still, carrying the faint scent of mildew and dust. The main hallway stretched out before us, lined with empty classrooms. Most of the doors were hanging off their hinges, and the floor was littered with debris, crumpled papers, broken chairs, and shards of glass. Ben moved ahead confidently, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "See? Nothing to worry about," he said over his shoulder. I nodded, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't entirely alone. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards under our feet. We wandered through the halls, peeking into classrooms and finding little more than peeling paint and forgotten remnants of the past. Old textbooks sat on the shelves, their pages yellowed with age. Chalkboards still bore faint, faded writing, like ghosts of lessons long past. "Can you believe this?" Ben said, pointing to a stack of dusty notebooks in one corner. "It's like they just left everything here." I bent down to pick one up, flipping through its pages. It was filled with messy handwriting, the kind you'd expect from middle school kids. Dates scrawled in the margins placed it sometime in the early 80s. For a while, it felt like just another one of our harmless adventures exploring, joking, reminiscing about the past. But then, as we entered the old science lab at the far end of the hall, something shifted. Ben stopped in his tracks, his flashlight aimed at the blackboard. "Hey, you see that?" I stepped closer, squinting in the dim light. The board, which had been blank when we walked in, now had faint markings on it, like someone had just written on it with chalk. The words were barely legible, but they looked like fragments of a sentence. "Did you do that earlier?" I asked, my voice low. Ben shook his head, frowning. "No, I didn't even come in here yet." We stared at the board in silence, the weight of the moment settling over us. It was the first hint that this night was going to be anything but ordinary. Standing in that dusty, decaying science lab, my eyes locked on the faint chalk marks on the blackboard. I squinted, trying to make sense of the fragmented words. They weren't clear, just pieces of letters here and there, like someone had started to write something and then stopped. The letters themselves looked hurried, almost jittery, as though they had been scrawled by an unsteady hand. "Did someone else come in here before us?" I asked, my voice sounding louder than I intended in the silence of the abandoned building. Ben tilted his head, studying the blackboard. "No way. No one's been in here for years. Look at this place. It's falling apart." I glanced around the room, letting his words sink in. The floor was littered with broken tiles, and cobwebs hung in thick clusters from the corners of the ceiling. The air was damp, carrying the faint metallic tang of rust. Everything about this place screamed neglect. Still, the chalk writing didn't feel like the work of time or decay. Ben stepped closer to the board, brushing a layer of dust off its surface with the sleeve of his hoodie. "Maybe it's just old writing that was hidden under the dust. But why does it look so fresh?" I asked. My voice was low, like I was afraid of disturbing something. Ben didn't answer immediately. Instead, he held his flashlight steady, illuminating the faint marks. Slowly, he traced the outline of one letter with his finger. It looked like a W, though it was shaky and incomplete. "It's probably nothing," he said after a moment, his tone more dismissive than confident. "Someone could have been in here years ago and left this. It's just the light making it look weird." I nodded, though his explanation didn't sit right with me. The writing seemed too clean, too deliberate to have been left undisturbed for decades. Still, I didn't argue. The logical side of me wanted to believe Ben was right. that there was a simple explanation for what we were seeing. "Let's check out the rest of the place," Ben said, already heading toward the door. "This is just the first room. Who knows what else we'll find?" I followed him, my steps slower and more cautious. As we moved through the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that the air had grown colder. Not enough to see our breath, but just enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. I told myself it was the open windows and the night air seeping in, though the rationalization didn't help much. We continued exploring, moving from room to room. Most of the classrooms were in worse shape than the last. Some had collapsed ceilings, their floors covered in rotting wood and broken plaster. Others were nearly empty, stripped bare of anything but the skeletons of old desks and chairs. But then we reached another classroom, one that looked almost untouched compared to the others. The desks were still upright, arranged in neat rows as if waiting for students to return. The chalkboard at the front of the room was blank, but a small pile of chalk sat on the ledge beneath it. "Now this is creepy," Ben muttered, shining his flashlight around the room. I nodded in agreement. It felt wrong, seeing everything so intact when the rest of the school had been left to decay. The stillness in the room was heavy, almost suffocating. Ben walked over to one of the desks and brushed the dust off its surface. "It's like a time capsule," he said. "You'd think the whole place would look like this, but it's just this one room." I didn't respond. My attention was drawn to the chalkboard. For reasons I couldn't explain, it felt like it was watching us or maybe waiting. The small pile of chalk seemed oddly deliberate, as if someone had set it there recently. I turned to Ben, who was now rummaging through a drawer in the teacher's desk. "We should probably keep moving," I said. He looked up at me, raising an eyebrow. "What's the rush?" "This is the best room we've seen so far." "Yeah, and that's what makes it weird," I replied. "Doesn't it feel?" "Off to you?" Ben hesitated, his playful demeanor faltering for the first time. He glanced around the room, his eyes lingering on the chalkboard. "Maybe a little," he admitted. Before I could say anything else, there was a faint sound behind us, a soft scratching noise, like chalk being dragged across a board. We froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Ben nodded, his eyes wide. Slowly, we both turned to face the chalkboard. The sound had stopped, but something had changed. A single word was now written on the board. "Why?" Ben stepped back, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Okay, what the hell is going on?" I didn't answer. My throat felt dry, and my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I took a shaky step toward the board, trying to convince myself that what I was seeing wasn't real. Maybe it was already there, and we just didn't notice it, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "You're kidding, right?" Ben snapped. "We would have seen that." He was right. The word was written in bright, clean chalk, as if someone had just finished writing it. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. Ben nodded, already moving toward the door. But as we stepped into the hallway, the sound came again, the same scratching noise, only louder this time. It echoed down the corridor, bouncing off the walls like a taunt. We stopped in our tracks, neither of us daring to move. The noise continued, steady and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was writing on the chalkboard wanted us to hear every stroke. Ben grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "We need to leave. Now." I didn't argue. We turned and started walking quickly toward the way we had come in, our flashlights flickering as we went. The air felt heavier with every step, pressing down on us like an invisible weight. But then, just as we reached the main hallway, a door slammed shut behind us. We both jumped, spinning around to face the noise. The sound echoed through the empty school, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Was that the room we just left? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ben nodded, his face pale. "Let's keep moving." We broke into a jog, our footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Every rational explanation I came up with fell apart under the weight of what we'd seen and heard. As we neared the exit, I glanced over my shoulder. For a split second, I thought I saw something in the distance, a faint, shadowy figure standing at the end of the hall. "Don't stop," Ben said, his voice tight with fear. I turned back around, focusing on the gap in the fence that was now in sight. We didn't stop running until we were outside, the cool night air hitting our faces like a slap. We didn't speak as we climbed back through the fence and walked to the car. It wasn't until we were both sitting inside, doors locked, that Ben finally broke the silence. "What the hell just happened?" he asked, his voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the school wasn't just an old, abandoned building. Something else was there, something that wanted us to know it was watching. The next few days after that night in the abandoned school were filled with a heavy silence. Ben and I hardly spoke about what had happened, as if saying the words aloud would make it more real. But the unease hung between us, an invisible weight neither of us could shake. The memory of that chalkboard, the way the writing had appeared out of nowhere, lingered in my mind every time I closed my eyes. The feeling of being watched was still there, like an uninvited guest, lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. It was the following weekend when we decided we couldn't ignore it any longer. We had to go back. "I can't stop thinking about it," I said to Ben, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to find out what's really going on in that place." Ben shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the unease still clear in his eyes. "I don't know, man. The last time we were there, it wasn't just creepy. It was something else." I didn't have a solid answer for him, only a deep sense of dread mixed with curiosity that wouldn't let me move on. There were questions that needed answering. The idea that we'd experienced something supernatural, something beyond our understanding, was too much to ignore. So we planned the return trip. We told ourselves it was just to check things out, to see if the chalkboard had been a weird coincidence, if the strange noises had a rational explanation. But deep down, I knew neither of us really believed that. The day was overcast, with thick clouds rolling overhead like the sky itself was holding its breath. We made our way to the school, the streets empty and silent around us. As we walked through the entrance again, the chill from before settled over us like a fog, and the building seemed even more oppressive than it had been. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under our feet as we entered the hallway. But there was something else, something darker. The sense of being watched had returned, sharper this time, more intense. "This feels different," I said, glancing over at Ben. "I don't know. It's like the place is alive." Ben didn't respond, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He didn't want to be here, and neither did I, but the need to understand what was happening was stronger than our fear. We made our way to the science room first. The moment we stepped inside, I noticed something was off. The chalkboard, which had been completely clean when we left, now had a fresh line of writing across it. "Who the hell?" I began, my voice trailing off as I took a step closer. The words were clear now, more defined than they had been the last time. "What do you want?" My stomach twisted into knots. Ben and I exchanged uneasy glances. "I don't want to be here," Ben muttered, turning to leave. But before we could move, there was that sound again, the soft scratching of chalk against the board, like someone was writing directly behind us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I spun around, my heart racing. Nothing. The board was still empty, the words intact, untouched. The scratching sound had stopped. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. "Did you hear that?" Ben nodded, his face pale. "I heard it." We were no longer alone in the room. The air felt thick, heavy, like we were suffocating in a cloud that was both cold and suffocating. There was a damp, musty smell in the room now, almost like wet paper or rotting wood. I felt my skin crawl as I slowly backed away from the chalkboard. "Let's get out of here," Ben said, his voice shaky. But before we could turn, the door to the room slammed shut behind us. the sound echoing through the hall. We jumped in unison, both of us staring at the door as though expecting it to open on its own. "It's locked," Ben said in disbelief, shaking the handle with a sense of urgency. "We're trapped." I glanced around, my eyes frantic. The windows were sealed tight, covered with layers of grime and dust. There was no escape. The room was getting colder, the walls seeming to close in on us. And then, from somewhere in the room, we heard a voice. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it seemed to come from every corner of the room, 1,000 voices overlapping each other in a garbled mess. They were saying something, but I couldn't make out the words. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum in my ears. Ben looked around, panic creeping into his eyes. "This is insane, man. We need to get out." I nodded, my hand reaching for the door again. I could feel the sweat on my palms as I tried to turn the handle, but the door remained locked, as if it was never meant to open. Suddenly, the voices stopped. There was a long, suffocating silence before the chalkboard at the front of the room flickered with new writing. "Help!" It was sharp and jagged, the letters jagging out in strange, unnatural directions. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. Did you see that?" Ben gasped, stepping back from the board. Before I could answer, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the air. The sound of breathing filled the silence, loud, labored, as if something was standing right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows of the empty room, stretching long and eerie in the dim light of our flashlights. "We have to get out," I said, my voice tight with fear. But Ben wasn't listening. He was standing by the door, his hand frozen on the handle. His eyes were wide, staring at something behind me. I turned, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. The figure. It was standing in the doorway, tall, thin, and shrouded in darkness. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, like a weight pressing into my chest. "Ben," I gasped, my voice shaking. "What is that?" Ben didn't answer. His face had gone pale, his mouth moving silently as he tried to speak, but couldn't. I reached for him, but before I could make a move, the figure stepped forward. Its feet didn't make a sound as it glided toward us, and the room seemed to close in even tighter, the walls pressing against us like we were caught in a trap. "We need to go," I said, grabbing Ben's arm. But my voice felt like a distant memory, barely audible over the pounding in my chest. Before I could even finish the sentence, the figure vanished, like smoke disappearing into the air. The door swung open by itself. "Let's go now," I said, nearly dragging Ben behind me as we stumbled out into the hallway. We didn't speak as we ran back through the school, our footsteps echoing against the walls. The oppressive silence pressed down harder with each passing second, and the air felt even colder now. It wasn't until we were safely outside, breathless and gasping for air, that I turned to Ben. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Ben didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at the building, his expression blank. We left that night, and we didn't go back. But the feeling, the weight of what we'd seen, of what had been waiting for us inside that school, didn't leave. It followed us, even in the dark of our own homes, hanging over us like a shadow. We both knew, deep down, that whatever was in that school hadn't finished with us. It had been nearly a week since we left the school, and still, neither Ben nor I could shake the feeling of being watched. Our days had been filled with restless nights, the weight of the unknown pressing on us in ways we couldn't explain. Each time I closed my eyes, I was haunted by the darkness of the school, the figure that had appeared before us, and the faint voices that had filled the air. Something in that building had reached out to us, and it wasn't finished. Ben called me late one night. His voice was different, urgent. "We need to go back," he said. "I can't stop thinking about it. We have to find out what's going on. I think it's calling us." His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Part of me knew he was right. That's the thing about fear, it pushes you. makes you do things you'd never consider when you're in your right mind. The other part of me, the logical part, told me to stay far, far away. But I couldn't. I had to know what was going on. "I'll pick you up in 30, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The drive to the school was long, and the closer we got, the heavier the silence became between us. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We both knew what awaited us. When we reached the school, the same oppressive feeling from our previous visit returned, almost instantly. The building loomed like a giant in the dark, its windows' dark eyes staring down at us, daring us to enter. We parked and sat there for a moment, the engine idling as we both tried to gather the courage to step out. "This is it," Ben finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was shaky. He didn't sound like himself, more like someone trying to convince himself he wasn't making a huge mistake. "Yeah," I replied, "but we can't stop now." We stepped out of the car, and I felt that cold breath against my skin again, like the air itself had been waiting for us. The door to the school was still ajar, a single rusted hinge creaking in the wind, beckoning us inside. We hesitated for only a moment before stepping over the threshold. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the hallway, the silence enveloping us like a blanket. The chalkboard in the science room was waiting for us, but it was different now. The writing from the last time we were here was gone, as if it had never been there at all. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of something decaying. I could hear Ben breathing heavily beside me, his footsteps faltering as we reached the doorway. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice strained. "Where's the writing?" I didn't have an answer. I just stepped inside, my gaze sweeping over the room. The place felt wrong. It wasn't just the silence. It was the feeling that something was hiding, something waiting. I could sense it in the air, like it was breathing with us. The floor creaked underfoot, and the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. I pulled my jacket tighter around me. And that's when I saw it. The chalkboard. It had changed. There were new words written on it, but they weren't normal. "You're not supposed to be here." The letters were jagged and uneven, the handwriting erratic. But what struck me the most was the way they appeared slowly, as if someone were writing them in real time. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Ben," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's happening again." Ben took a step forward, his hand reaching out towards the board, but I grabbed his arm to stop him. "No, don't touch it," I said, my voice rising. But it was too late. As Ben's fingers hovered near the chalkboard, the writing shifted again, more words appearing in rapid succession. "It's too late." Suddenly, the chalkboard shook, the words skittering across the surface like they were alive. I felt the air grow heavier, suffocating. Ben stepped back, his face pale as he stumbled towards the door. But the door slammed shut. We were trapped again. The sound of scraping chalk returned, louder this time, as if something was clawing at the board from the other side. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound, the very foundation of the building groaning as if it were waking up. "What is it?" Ben screamed, his voice raw with fear. "What the hell is happening?" I couldn't answer him. I was paralyzed with fear, staring at the board as the writing continued to spill out, faster now, more frantic. "You're the next." It was like the words were a countdown, and every syllable seemed to echo through my skull. I could feel my heart pounding, my chest tightening with each passing second. I turned to Ben, but his face was twisted with terror. His eyes were wide, fixed on the door, as though he could will it to open. Suddenly, the temperature dropped so sharply that I could see my breath, each exhale coming out in a visible cloud. The air became dense, thick with an oppressive, suffocating presence. I could feel it, the pressure on my chest, the sensation that something was moving in the room with us, something that wasn't human. And then, the lights flickered. The faintest movement caught my eye, a shadow darting across the back of the room. It wasn't Ben. It wasn't me. It was something else. "Ben," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Do you see that?" He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the door, his body rigid with fear. The shadow moved again, this time slower, as if it was circling us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I turned, trying to find an escape, but the room was closing in on us. The chalkboard began to shake violently now, the letters forming into something new, something terrifying. Your souls are mine. The room seemed to spin. The walls closed in, the shadows deepening until there was nothing but darkness. The air was thick with the smell of rock, and I could hear the faint sound of breathing again. But this time it wasn't just mine or Ben's. It was coming from everywhere, from all directions. And then, with a horrible, bone-chilling screech, the figure appeared again. It was taller this time, its form more defined, more solid. Its face, if you could even call it that, was a mess of blackness, a void where eyes should have been, and a mouth that was stretched wide in an impossible grin. Its hands were long and skeletal, and as it reached toward us, I could feel the temperature plummet further, as if my very soul were being drained. Ben screamed. He screamed in a way I'd never heard before, a primal, guttural sound filled with pure terror. He turned to run, but the figure was faster. It moved toward him, and in the blink of an eye, it was there, its hand gripping his throat. I rushed forward, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I could do was watch as Ben's body was lifted off the ground, his face contorted in pain, his eyes pleading for help. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared, leaving nothing but the lingering chill in the air. Ben dropped to the floor, gasping for breath, his body trembling uncontrollably. I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, and my chest felt like it was going to implode. The figure was gone, but the damage had been done. We were no longer alone. Something had been awakened in that school. Something that was far older, far darker than we could ever imagine. And it wasn't finished with us yet. Ben and I didn't speak for a long time after the figure disappeared. We were both frozen, staring at the spot where it had been, as though if we didn't move, it wouldn't come back. The room, which had felt so alive with malevolent energy, now felt hollow, empty. I wanted to run. I wanted to grab Ben and flee, but my legs felt weak, as if the fear had seeped into my bones and made it impossible to move. My thoughts were scattered, too jumbled to make sense of anything. I tried to focus, tried to make sense of what had just happened, but the more I thought about it, the less real it seemed. It felt like a nightmare, like I was going to wake up and find myself back in the safety of my own bed. But the cold, the darkness, the lingering presence, it was all too real. Ben finally broke the silence. His voice was barely a whisper, and I could hear the tremor in it. We need to get out of here. Now. I nodded, finally able to move, my legs still shaky as I made my way toward the door. Ben followed close behind, still breathing heavily. The hallway outside the room was quiet, too quiet, and as we walked down it, the distant sound of footsteps echoed in the emptiness, as if someone or something was following us. I turned to look, half expecting to see the figure looming behind us, but there was nothing. Just the darkness stretching on endlessly. We reached the front doors of the school, but when I tried to open them, I found they wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but the door refused to open. Panic gripped my chest, my breathing quickening as I tugged harder. What the hell is going on? Why won't it open? Ben rushed over and tried his hand at the door, but it was the same. We were trapped again. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thicker with each passing second. The cold was unbearable now, almost as if the temperature had dropped to freezing point. My breath came out in white clouds, and I could feel the familiar weight of dread creeping up my spine. We can't stay here, Ben said, his voice strained, almost frantic. There has to be another way out. Let's find it. But there was no way out. We checked the windows, but they were all locked tight. We pounded on the doors, hoping someone outside would hear us, but there was nothing. No one. It felt like the school had swallowed us whole, and we were now part of its twisted, suffocating grip. The figure's words from earlier kept echoing in my mind. Your souls are mine. I wasn't sure if it had been a warning or a promise, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized something important. It had been waiting for us. We were always meant to return. The school had called us back, just like it had called others before us, and once it had us, it wouldn't let us go. I turned to Ben, my voice barely a whisper. We're not going to make it out of here, are we? Ben didn't answer right away. His eyes were wide, his face pale, and for the first time, I saw the same fear in him that I had been feeling all along. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe? A sense of dread that he hadn't said the things that needed to be said, hadn't warned me about what we were getting into. We have to try, he said finally, his voice shaking. We can't give up now. But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. I felt it too, the crushing sense that no matter what we did, no matter how hard we tried to escape, it wouldn't make a difference. We were at the mercy of whatever dark force had taken hold of the school, and it wasn't letting go. We spent what felt like hours trying every exit, every door, every window, but nothing worked. It was as if the building itself was alive, twisting and contorting, locking us in. The air was heavy with a sense of finality, the silence now unbearable. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me, until I could hardly breathe. The darkness around us seemed to grow, pulling in close like a thick fog. But then, just as suddenly, there was a shift. A crackle in the air, a disturbance, and the door we had been trying to open for hours creaked, then gave way. The sound of the latch releasing was like the sound of chains breaking, and I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my chest as I rushed toward the door. Ben was right behind me, his hand gripping my arm, pulling me forward. But even as we stepped out into the night, into the fresh air, I knew we hadn't escaped. It wasn't over. It would never be over. We ran without looking back, our feet pounding the pavement as we made our way down the street, as far away from that school as possible. The night was eerily quiet, the streets empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I don't know how far we ran or how long we kept going, but eventually we stopped. We found ourselves standing on a street corner, breathless, staring at the school in the distance. It loomed there, dark and silent, its windows staring back at us like eyes, waiting. And then, from the distance, I saw it. The faintest flicker of light from one of the windows. A figure standing in the darkness, watching us. I couldn't make out the details, but I knew it was the same figure. The one that had been chasing us, tormenting us, pulling us back into its grasp. We were still in its grip. Ben's eyes locked on mine, his face pale with fear. What do we do now? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that no matter how far we ran, no matter how many miles we put between ourselves and that cursed school, it would always be there, watching, waiting, and we would never be free. That night, we both left. Ben moved to another city, cutting off all ties with the past. I stayed, but every time I closed my eyes, I could still see the faint chalk writing, the words that had appeared on the board, the cold touch of the shadow that had followed us. We both knew, deep down, that some things never let go, and we had become a part of that darkness. I've often found myself thinking back on that night, and it feels like a shadow always follows me, no matter where I go. The memory of it doesn't fade. It settles deep within me like a scar I can't quite heal. The feeling of that place, the school, the corridors, the blackboard never really leaves me. I'll never forget how real the fear felt, how tangible the darkness was that surrounded us. But now, it's more than just a memory. It's something that lingers, something that has shaped me into a person I didn't know I could become. After Ben left, I tried to go back to my normal life. It wasn't easy. I didn't feel the same. I couldn't look at a school the same way again, couldn't pass by an old building without a chill running down my spine. It's funny how the things we think are just stories, just rumors, can sneak up on us when we least expect them. The school had been just that, a story, a place everyone talked about in whispers. But now, it was a part of me, a part of what I would carry with me for the rest of my life. I moved away from the area eventually. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I couldn't look over my shoulder without seeing the blackboard's faint writing, those words that had been written in chalk, as if they had been waiting there for someone to read them. They had never really been erased, I think. Not truly. They were still there, somewhere etched into the fabric of that place, into the very air that filled it. I sometimes wonder if I will ever feel completely free of it. Every time I close my eyes, I can almost see that figure, that shadow, standing in the doorway, waiting for me to return. And every time I remind myself, I'm safe now. But safety feels like a fleeting thing, a fragile illusion. The reality is, there's no real escape from something that's already become a part of you. It's always there, lurking in the back of your mind, in the corners of your thoughts. I've met people who've experienced things like I did. They don't talk about it much. They don't have to. When you've seen the same thing, felt the same fear, the same weight of the unknown, words don't really explain it. They just nod and understand, as if the truth doesn't need to be spoken. They too have that same thing, that same knowing, that same chill that creeps in no matter where you go. In the years that followed, I thought I might be the last person to witness what happened at that school. I thought the place had been forgotten, lost in the rubble of time. But I heard things, strange things, whispered among those brave or foolish enough to go near the school. Some say they've seen lights flickering inside. Some say the windows aren't as empty as they seem. People talk about the building like it's haunted, a place full of unfinished business. It's strange though. When I go back to the area, when I stand at the edge of where that school once stood, I don't see anything but an empty lot. Grass overgrown, old, rusted gates. Nothing to suggest that something terrible had happened there. Nothing to show that people had gone in, never to come back out. But I know what happened. I know what it feels like to be hunted by something you can't see, something that doesn't care about your logic, your fears, or your hopes. Something that only wants one thing, to claim you. The building might be gone, but it doesn't matter. The essence of it remains. The air around that lot is thick, charged, as if the energy of the place still lingers, refusing to dissipate. It's as if the darkness of the school has seeped into the earth, like oil into soil, and no matter how much time passes, no matter how many people forget about it, the stain remains. The place has its way of drawing you back, one way or another. Maybe not directly, but in subtle ways. It knows when you're close, even if you're miles away. It knows when you're searching for answers, even when you think you've moved on. I still feel it sometimes, the pull. It's a quiet thing, a whisper you almost don't notice at first, but it grows louder. The memories of the chalk on the board, the sound of footsteps in empty hallways, the weight of the darkness that seemed to consume the school, it all comes rushing back. And every time it does, I remind myself that I survived. I escaped. But there's always that lingering thought, always that question in the back of my mind. What if the school was never trying to trap us? What if it was trying to warn us? What if, in some twisted way, it was waiting for us to understand that there was something far worse, something even darker, waiting just beyond the walls? What if what we thought was a curse was, in reality, something else entirely? Something far beyond our comprehension, something that had been there long before we ever stepped foot inside. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't over. Maybe it's only just beginning. So as I sit here, reflecting on everything that happened, I can't help but wonder, who else is out there, standing at the edge, staring into the darkness? Who else has heard the stories and thought they were just that, stories? Who else will go looking for the truth, not knowing that the truth may be the last thing they ever find? Maybe the school is gone, but the fear, the truth, the darkness, it's still very much alive. And perhaps it's only a matter of time before someone else finds themselves in its grip, just like we did. I don't know if that's a comforting thought or a terrifying one. But I do know one thing. Once you step into the darkness, it never truly lets you go. Not entirely. And neither will the school. It all began a few months ago, when I was just starting out with a local delivery company. The hours were long, but the work was steady. I had always been the type of person who found satisfaction in small, everyday things. The hum of the engine as I drove through neighborhoods, the warmth of the sun as it streamed through the windshield, and the simple act of delivering packages to people who ordered things from places I'd never even heard of. It was an honest living, and it paid the bills. I had a routine, a rhythm, and honestly, I liked it that way. My life was far from extraordinary, and in a way, that was the best part. I was assigned to a quiet suburban neighborhood. The houses were spread out, each with its own large front lawn, and the streets were lined with old trees that cast long shadows during the evening hours. The people who lived there were nice most of the time, a bit reserved, but polite, and they didn't seem to mind a delivery driver stopping by their homes. I was just another face in the crowd. The deliveries were easy most of the time. I would leave the packages on the doorstep and ring the bell before heading off to the next address. One house, though, stood out. It wasn't like the others, not by a long shot. The place was old, really old, with cracked windows and a driveway that hadn't seen a car in years. The lawn was overgrown, the grass reaching up to the porch in some places. The house looked as though it was falling apart, and every time I delivered something there, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was abandoned. Yet, every time I stopped, there was always someone home. At first, I thought it was just another of the strange quirks of this neighborhood, how some people seem to live in homes that looked like they belonged in another time, while others built there. Brand new, pristine mansions just down the street. The house had a nameplate by the front door, though it was half covered by the ivy creeping over it. The name was faded, but I could make it out just enough to know it belonged to someone named Grayson. I didn't think much of it at first. Like I said, I didn't ask questions about the people I was delivering to. My job was simple: get the package to the right address. But there was something about that house and the person who lived there that I couldn't quite place. One chilly autumn afternoon, I pulled up to the house again. The day was winding down, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. I had one more package to deliver here, and then I could finally head home. As I grabbed the parcel, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, just a crack, barely noticeable, but enough to catch my attention. I hesitated for a moment, but I did what I always did. I rang the doorbell and waited. As I stood there, the air felt heavy, colder than it should have been for the season. The winds picked up slightly, rustling the leaves on the ground, and I felt my skin prickling with an odd sensation. Something felt wrong, but at the time, I chalked it up to the fatigue of a long day of deliveries. The door creaked open ever so slightly more, and I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving inside the house. A chill ran down my spine, but I convinced myself it was just an old house making noises after all. Old houses did that, didn't they? The door didn't open any further, so I gently placed the package on the doorstep and stepped back, ready to leave. But before I could turn, I heard a voice. Quiet at first, barely above a whisper, but distinct enough to send an uncomfortable shiver through me. "Are you just going to leave it there?" I froze, my body tense as I slowly turned around to face the door. There, standing in the doorway, was a man I had never seen before. He was tall, thin, and dressed in a dark, almost formal-looking suit. His features were sharp, and his hair was neatly combed back, but there was something strange about him. He didn't look like he belonged there. Something about his presence felt wrong. His gaze was fixed on me, and for a moment, it felt as if he was studying me, taking in every detail of my appearance. "Oh, I was just leaving it on the doorstep," I said, trying to sound as casual as possible, even though my heart was racing. "You're Grayson, right?" The man didn't answer at first. Instead, he glanced down at the package, then back at me. His eyes were unsettling, too intense, like he was trying to read my thoughts. "You didn't bring it inside," he said, his tone strangely calm but insistent. A feeling of unease swept over me. "Well, it's just a small package. It doesn't look like it needs to be brought inside." "You're wrong," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I prefer it when the packages are brought inside. It's more polite." There was something about his words, the way he said them, that set off alarm bells in my head. But I couldn't quite figure out what was wrong. I glanced back at the truck parked in front of the house and then at the man. Sorry, I really have to go," I said, my voice shaking ever so slightly. Before I could take a step away, he reached out, almost too quickly, and placed a hand on the door frame. His grip was firm, unyielding, as if he was holding me there. "You will come inside," he said, his voice now colder, more demanding. I stood there, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the situation. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to get in the truck and drive away as fast as I could. But something in the man's gaze held me there, like an invisible force, like I couldn't break free. Something wasn't right. I had a decision to make. But before I could act, the door behind him creaked open wider, and I heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the house. I couldn't tell if the footsteps were real or if they were just a product of my growing panic, but in that moment, I felt trapped. Without thinking, I turned and ran back to my truck, barely getting the door shut before the man spoke again. "Next time," he called, his voice trailing behind me, "bring the package inside." My hands were shaking as I started the truck and sped off down the street, the man's words lingering in my mind. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something. Or someone. That night, I couldn't sleep, replaying every detail of the encounter. There was something about that house and about Grayson that didn't add up. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The days after that first encounter with Grayson seemed to blur together. I tried to push the strange interaction to the back of my mind, telling myself that it was nothing more than an odd coincidence. The man had acted strange, sure, but he was probably just an eccentric homeowner. It wasn't unheard of for people to be a little particular about their deliveries. I had no reason to go overboard, to overthink it. After all, my job was simple: delivering packages, moving on to the next address. Nothing more, nothing less. But as the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time I drove through that neighborhood, the old house stood out, its crumbling facade a constant reminder of the unsettling encounter. I tried not to think about it, but it wasn't long before I started noticing other strange things I couldn't easily explain away. One afternoon, just a few days after my first delivery to Grayson's house, I was assigned a late shift. The sun was setting earlier now, and the streets were growing darker by the minute. I had a few more deliveries to make, and I was hoping to finish up quickly so I could go home and relax. As I approached the neighborhood, I couldn't help but notice that there was a strange stillness in the air. The wind had died down, and the usual hustle of the neighborhood seemed absent. The houses all looked the same, quiet and calm, but something was off. It felt like the whole street was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When I turned onto the familiar road where Grayson's house stood, I instinctively glanced over. The house was darker than usual, the shadows creeping up the worn-out siding, the windows reflecting the dull glow of the streetlights. But what struck me immediately was the mailbox. The little red flag, which had been perfectly positioned just a few days earlier, was now bent, hanging at an odd angle. It was as though someone had been tampering with it recently, trying to adjust it, or worse, trying to make it look like nothing was wrong when clearly something had been disturbed. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I pulled up to the curb. The last time I had been here, I had barely escaped Grayson's unnerving demands. This time, though, I had a feeling something was different. I couldn't explain it, but I had this deep, irrational sense that I wasn't alone. I parked the truck and grabbed the package. My hand lingered on the door handle for a second longer than necessary. There was no rational reason to feel uneasy. I delivered to countless houses, and most of them had been more or less the same. But this time, there was a creeping sense of dread that followed me as I walked toward Grayson's front porch. I reached the door and rang the bell, standing back and waiting for someone to answer. I waited longer than usual. Usually, the door would open after a moment, and I'd hand over the package without much fanfare. But now, there was only silence. A strange, heavy silence. I felt a twinge of unease as I glanced around. The winds had picked up again, rattling the leaves on the trees, but the air felt colder than it had any right to be for an early fall evening. My breath came out in visible puffs, even though I was only standing on the porch. The door remained closed, but I couldn't help but feel like someone was watching me from inside the house. It was as though the shadows within were thickening, pressing in on me. And then, just as I started to turn away, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Through the small crack in the door, I noticed a figure standing inside. It wasn't Grayson, no. This figure was shorter, hunched over. The silhouette was thin, and the shape of it seemed wrong, distorted in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't moving, but I could see its outline, standing completely still in the darkness of the hallway. The figure was barely visible, but its presence was undeniable. I froze, my hand still on the doorbell. I couldn't move. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure inside the house shifted slightly, as though it had noticed me standing there. I stood there, frozen in place, trying to process what I was seeing. The figure didn't move or make any noise, but it was unmistakable. There was someone or something inside that house, and it was waiting for me. It felt like an eternity before the figure disappeared into the shadows. I snapped out of my stupor, my pulse racing. I backed away from the door, my feet unsteady beneath me. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to get in my truck and never look back. But something kept me there. Something kept my feet glued to the spot. I glanced down at the package in my hand, my breath shaky. I had a job to do. I had to deliver it. It wasn't my place to question why someone else wasn't opening the door. I didn't have the time to stand there thinking about whatever I had just seen or thought I had seen. Taking a deep breath, I quickly stepped back to the door and placed the package on the ground. I rang the bell one last time, though my hand trembled slightly. Then I turned and walked briskly back to the truck. I didn't look back. The figure, the shadows, the strange feeling that had settled over the house, all of it stayed with me. When I reached the truck, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The house stood there, dark and foreboding. The door was still slightly ajar, and there was no sign of Grayson, no indication that anyone had even acknowledged my presence. As I started the engine and pulled away, the unease continued to gnaw at me. I couldn't explain what had happened, what I had seen. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Had I imagined the figure inside the house? Or was there something else going on here? The whole drive home, my thoughts were a whirlwind. It wasn't until I pulled into my driveway that I realized I had left the headlights on the entire time. My hands were still shaking when I turned off the truck, and I felt the weight of the unsettling encounter press down on me. Something wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, but I couldn't ignore it either. Later that night, I tried to push the incident out of my mind. I tried to convince myself that I was just tired, that I had been imagining things. But as I lay in bed, the memories of the strange figure inside the house and the eerie silence lingered. Something about Grayson's house, about the way it felt when I was there, kept me awake long into the night. And deep down, I knew that the worst was yet to come. The following week, things only got stranger. At first, I thought I was just paranoid. After all, I had been through some pretty unusual experiences in my line of work, and delivering packages late at night could make anyone a little jumpy. But the more time passed, the more I realized that what I had felt on that first visit to Grayson's house wasn't just a trick of the mind. There was something happening there, something I couldn't ignore, and it was slowly creeping its way into every aspect of my life. It started small, like it always does in these kinds of situations. I was delivering packages again, the same neighborhood, the same streets, but each time I passed Grayson's house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't the house itself. It still had that crumbling, neglected look, but there was a presence there. Oh wait, the air seemed thicker, heavier when I drove past. Sometimes it felt like the house was watching me. But of course, that was ridiculous. A house couldn't watch you, could it? Yet every time I drove by, the feeling only grew stronger. One afternoon, I had to make another delivery to the same neighborhood. As I pulled into the street, my eyes immediately sought out Grayson's house. This time, the front yard was different. The grass, which had been overgrown and wild, had been neatly trimmed. The hedges that had once been out of control were now clipped perfectly. It was almost as if someone had been doing maintenance on the place, someone who had no business being there. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts from my mind. It was just another oddity. No need to make a big deal out of it. But as I parked and grabbed the package, my unease only deepened. I couldn't see any lights on inside the house, but there was a faint glow coming from behind the curtains, as though someone was standing near the window, waiting. My pulse quickened as I approached the front door, this time more hesitant than before. I rang the doorbell, my hand trembling just a bit. I waited and waited. No one answered. I rang again, this time with more urgency. Still nothing. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing on me. It was unnatural, almost suffocating. I stepped back and looked around, scanning the yard and the surrounding area. No movement, no sound, other than the faint rustle of the trees in the breeze. But then I saw something. A shadow flickered across the window. It wasn't a person, at least, not in the way I was used to seeing someone move. This shadow was quick, darting in and out of view, as though something was trying to hide behind the curtains. I felt a chill run down my spine, my breath catching in my throat. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but there was something pulling me toward the door, something that refused to let me walk away. I rang the doorbell once more, but this time I didn't wait. Instead, I stepped back toward my truck, the package still in my hand. As I reached the truck, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. A soft, almost inaudible scraping noise came from behind me, like someone dragging their fingers across the wooden floor of the house. I froze, the sound sending a wave of nausea through me. I slowly turned around, my eyes darting to the door, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was no one. The door was still closed, the faint glow behind the curtains still flickering like a heartbeat in the darkness. Without thinking, I started walking back toward the porch. It was as though my body had moved on its own accord. I set the package down gently in front of the door, my hands shaking now. I rang the doorbell one last time, but this time I didn't leave immediately. Instead, I stood there, staring at the house, feeling a strange pull to the place. It felt wrong, yet I couldn't bring myself to walk away. A sudden gust of wind swept through the street, rustling the leaves and sending a shiver down my spine. The temperature dropped, and I could feel the air thickening around me. I turned to leave again, but before I could, the door creaked open. My heart nearly stopped in my chest as I turned to face the figure standing in the doorway. It was Grayson, or at least, it looked like him. But there was something different about him. His face was pale, his eyes wide and hollow, as though he hadn't slept in days. His posture was unnaturally stiff, and his movements were slow, almost mechanical. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, staring at me. I swallowed hard, the fear rising in my throat. I left the package, I managed to say, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. You can take it from here. Grayson didn't respond. He simply nodded slowly, his head jerking in a way that made me uneasy. As he bent down to pick up the package, I couldn't help but notice the way his hand moved. It wasn't smooth or fluid. It was stiff, jerky, as though he was struggling to perform even the simplest of tasks. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the only sound the soft rustle of the leaves in the wind. The air felt colder now, the night darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And then, just as quickly as it had opened, the door slammed shut. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing in my chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I had just been in the presence of someone who clearly wasn't acting like himself, someone who seemed completely detached from reality. I wasn't sure what I had just seen, but something inside me told me that I shouldn't stick around to find out. I rushed back to my truck, my hands fumbling to start the engine. As I pulled away from the house, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The house stood dark and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Grayson, or whatever he was now, was still watching me. The next few days passed in a blur. I couldn't get that house, or Grayson's strange behavior, out of my mind. I kept hearing the scraping sound, like someone dragging their fingers along the wooden floor. It haunted me, followed me in my dreams, and crept into my waking thoughts. I told myself I was overreacting, that I needed to focus on my jobs and stop being so paranoid. But then, things started to happen, things I couldn't explain away so easily. One evening, I received a delivery order for Grayson's house again. I knew I couldn't keep avoiding it, so I drove to the neighborhood, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. When I arrived, the house was just as I remembered it, quiet, still, and unnerving. But this time, there was no shadow in the window, no figure standing behind the curtains, no scraping noise. Everything was still, too still. I rang the doorbell, but no one answered. I waited, then rang again. Still nothing. This time, something felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a strange sensation in the air, as if the house itself was alive, holding its breath, waiting for something. I glanced down at the package in my hand, my pulse quickening. The door was still closed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me inside. I placed the package on the doorstep and backed away slowly. As I did, I saw something flash in the window, just a flicker of movement, a shadow darting past. But when I looked again, there was nothing. I didn't stay any longer. I turned and hurried back to the truck, my heart pounding in my chest. I started the engine and drove off, my mind racing. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. As the days went on, I found myself drawn back to that house, compelled to return, even though every part of me screamed to stay away. I needed to know what was going on. I needed answers. But the closer I got to the truth, the more I realized that the answers I was seeking might not be ones I wanted to find. I had been avoiding Grayson's house for days, but that creeping sensation, the one I couldn't shake, kept pulling me back. It was as if there was someone inside that house waiting for me to uncover it. The house loomed on the edge of my thoughts, like a shadow hanging over my every mood, waiting for me to acknowledge it. No matter how much I tried to focus on my deliveries, the uneasy feeling wouldn't let up. I was on edge, my nerves fraying. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. The anxiety had built up to a breaking point, and something deep down told me that the answers I sought were there. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but I couldn't ignore the pull. I grabbed my keys and headed out, my footsteps heavy as I walked toward the truck. The drive to Grayson's house felt longer than usual. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my thoughts racing. As I turned onto the street, I saw the house in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the darkening sky. It stood there, as it always had, but tonight, something felt different. There was a subtle shift in the air, a tension that I couldn't quite place. The house seemed to be waiting for me, its silence palpable. I parked in front of the house, my heart beating faster with every passing second. The street was deserted, and the wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that almost sounded like whispers. My eyes scanned the windows, but there were no flickers of movement, no shadows lurking behind the curtains. It was just still, too still. The doorbell was my first step, my last line of defense. I rang it, and as I waited, my eyes darted to the window again, but there was nothing. I rang it again, more urgently this time, but still no answer. A chill ran through me, but I didn't turn away. Something told me this was the moment. The moment I would finally uncover what was hidden behind that door. I knocked harder than I had before, my fist pounding against the wood. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick. Then, suddenly, the door creaked open. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. There, standing in the doorway, was Grayson. But not the Grayson I remembered. He was different. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were wide and unblinking, like someone who hadn't slept in days, weeks, maybe. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, as though they were too large for him. He looked wrong. There was something off about him that I couldn't put my finger on. "Grayson?" I managed to say, my voice shaky. He didn't respond, but his lips twitched. It was almost as though he was struggling to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His gaze shifted over me, but it didn't seem to focus. He was staring, not at me, but through me, his eyes empty, like he wasn't really there. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice rising in concern. I took a step forward, but Grayson didn't move. The air between us seemed to thicken, and my skin prickled as though I was being watched from all sides. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, deeply wrong. I took another cautious step toward him, but then, without warning, Grayson moved. It wasn't a natural movement. His body jerked, stiff and mechanical, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. His hand shot up, grabbing my arm with unnatural strength. "Come inside," he said, his voice hoarse and cold, the words barely escaping his lips. A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to pull away, but his grip was unyielding, like iron. His eyes, wide and vacant, never left mine. It felt as though he was trying to force me into the house, trying to drag me into whatever nightmare awaited inside. "Let me go," I said, my voice rising in panic. My pulse was racing, and my breath came in sharp, quick bursts. Grayson didn't respond, just continued to stare at me with that empty, hollow look. His hand tightened around my wrist, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out from the fear that was slowly creeping up my throat. I yanked my arm back with all my strength, finally breaking free from his grip. My heart hammered in my chest, and I stumbled backward, desperate to put distance between myself and that twisted figure standing in the doorway. "What's happening to you?" I gasped, unable to tear my eyes away from him. The words were out before I could stop them, but Grayson didn't answer. He didn't even acknowledge me. His gaze was still fixed on the space just behind me, as if he was looking at something or someone else. I backed away, but the door slammed shut before I could turn and run. The sound of it echoed in the empty street, a final, deafening thud. I stood there for a moment, breathless and terrified, trying to process what had just happened. My mind was racing, and the cold night air only made the fear settle deeper into my bones. But then, I heard a sound from inside the house, soft but unmistakable. It was a voice, or at least something that sounded like a voice. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, followed by an odd whispering that seemed to come from every corner of the house. My blood ran cold, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that there was more to this than I had ever imagined. I turned to run, but before I could take a step, the door swung open again. This time, there was no sign of Grayson. The doorway was empty, but the house seemed to be calling me in. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and the air around me grew heavy with a strange energy. It felt as though the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting for me to step inside. I knew I should leave. My body screamed at me to run, to get out of there and never look back. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me toward that door, toward whatever lay beyond it. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a deep, primal urge, like I was being lured by some unseen force, something I couldn't resist. I stepped forward, my feet moving on their own, like a puppet on strings. As I crossed the threshold, I felt the temperature drop. The air inside was thick and musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floorboards creaked underfoot, as though the house was groaning in protest. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, a figure stood in the shadows. It was Grayson, or what used to be Grayson. His eyes were black, his skin ashen, and his mouth hung open in a grotesque grin that didn't belong on a human face. He was no longer just a man, he was something else, something far worse. I froze, paralyzed by the sight. Grayson, or whatever it was, took a step toward me, his movements jerky and unnatural. The whispering around me grew louder, and I could feel something crawling under my skin, twisting, pulling at me. A deep, gnawing fear gripped my chest, and I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, caught in the web of whatever dark force had taken hold of this house. Grayson's lips curled upward into a twisted smile. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped. And just as the words left his mouth, the lights flickered and the house seemed to come alive, its walls closing in around me, as though it was going to swallow me whole. In that moment, I knew that I had made a terrible mistake. I had walked into a nightmare that had no end. The fear that gripped me in that moment was unlike anything I had ever felt before. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing made sense. Grayson, or whatever he had become, moved toward me with that unholy grin still stretched across his face. I wanted to run, to turn and flee from that nightmarish place, but my body was frozen, paralyzed by a combination of fear and disbelief. He stepped closer, his movements jerky and unnatural, as though he were being dragged along by some invisible force. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath caught in my throat. The whispering was louder now, more insistent, but it wasn't coming from any one place. It seemed to fill the entire house, swirling around me like a swarm of angry bees. "You shouldn't have come," Grayson repeated, his voice now a rasp, barely recognizable as human. His words seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him, as if he were struggling to speak. But there was something in his eyes, something that wasn't Grayson. His pupils were wide, black voids, and his face had twisted into something grotesque. I had never seen him like this, and I knew in that instant that the man I had once known was gone. My legs finally moved, instinct kicking in as I turned to run. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct told me to get out of that house as quickly as possible. I bolted down the hallway, my footsteps loud against the creaking wooden floor, echoing through the eerie silence. But even as I ran, the house seemed to shift, the walls closing in around me. The air was thick, suffocating, and every breath felt like a struggle. I reached the front door, but it was no longer open. The door that had once been wide and inviting was now locked, its wooden surface dark and forbidding. Panic surged within me as I realized I was trapped. The whispering had grown louder, almost deafening, and I could feel the temperature drop even further, my breath visible in the cold air. My hands shook as I fumbled with the door handle, desperately trying to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, I could hear Grayson's footsteps. Slow, deliberate. His presence was like a dark cloud closing in, and I could feel his eyes boring into my back, even though I didn't dare look. I kept pulling at the door handle, my heart pounding in my chest, the fear threatening to overtake me. I could feel the house pressing in on me, pushing me further into despair, and for a moment, I thought I might lose my mind. Then, as if the house itself had made a decision, the door flew open. The force of it startled me, and I stumbled backward, nearly falling onto the cold ground outside. My eyes barely registered the dim light from the street lamp before I was out the door and running, my feet pounding against the ground. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. My legs were weak, my body trembling with exhaustion, but I didn't care. I just had to get away. I had to leave that place behind me. I jumped into the truck, slammed the door shut, and turned the key, not even waiting to make sure it was fully started before I hit the gas. The tires screeched as I sped away, the house disappearing in my rearview mirror. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me. The silence in the truck was oppressive, and the whispering had followed me, echoing in my ears, even though I knew it couldn't be real. I looked over my shoulder several times, convinced that Grayson, or whatever he had become, was somehow following me, watching me, but every time I turned, there was nothing but empty road behind me. When I finally reached my apartment, I parked in the driveway and sat there for a long time, the engine idling, staring at the darkened windows of my home. My heart was still racing, and my mind was in turmoil. What had happened back at that house? Who or what was Grayson now? And why had the house seemed so alive? I didn't have answers, and deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted them. I knew that going back to that house, facing whatever horror resided there, would only drag me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't escape. But even as I sat in my truck, safe for now, the unease continued to gnaw at me. It felt like the house hadn't let go of me, that it was still out there, waiting, watching. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak in the apartment made my heart race. Every flicker of light in the corner of my eye sent my pulse spiking. I sat up all night, staring at the clock, my thoughts consumed by what I had seen, by what Grayson had become. The house, the darkness, the whispers. The next morning, I went back to the neighborhood, but I couldn't bring myself to go anywhere near the house. It stood there, just as it always had, its windows dark and lifeless, but I knew better now. I had learned something I couldn't unlearn. The house wasn't just a building, it was something more. Something old, something that shouldn't have been. I never spoke to Grayson again. I never heard from him either. It was as if he had vanished, leaving only the memory of that twisted figure behind. The strange events that had unfolded in that house never truly made sense to me, but I knew I had narrowly escaped something far worse than I could ever imagine. The aftermath of that night lingered in my mind long after I left the neighborhood behind. It haunted me, a dark shadow in my thoughts, a reminder that there are things in this world that can't be explained. I told myself I was lucky to be alive, to have gotten out when I did. But the whispers never stopped. Even as I moved on with my life, they followed me, always in the back of my mind, just waiting for the moment when I would remember. Sometimes I still hear them. The whispers. They're softer now, but they're still there. And every time I hear them, I can't help but wonder, did I really escape? Or is something still waiting for me, just beyond the edge of my consciousness, patiently biding its time? I don't know. And to be honest, I'm not sure I want to find out. I thought for a while that the worst was over, that the nightmare had finally been left behind in that house, buried in the past. The memories faded, and life slowly started to feel normal again. I buried the horror in the back of my mind, trying to forget everything about that night, trying to convince myself that it was just a terrible series of events that had been manipulated by my own fear. But the whispers, the memories, they never truly left. It's been years now, and I've learned to live with the quiet, eerie presence of that house in my past. I moved away, changed jobs, made new friends. But sometimes, in the quiet moments when the world falls silent, I can feel it creeping back into my thoughts. I never returned to that house, never went near it again, and I never looked up Grayson. He had disappeared without a trace, and I don't know if he's still out there, wherever that thing took him. I couldn't risk finding out. In the years since, I've heard rumors, small talk, whispers, people who knew Grayson, people who knew the house, people who dared to approach it long after I had left, have their own strange stories. Some of them talk about how the house seems to beckon you in, how it calls to those who are drawn to it, and others swear it's not the house, but something within it, something ancient, something evil that has the power to twist everything around it. I've never dared ask for more details, but there's one thing that still disturbs me. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who escaped. That there were others who, like me, walked away from that house and never spoke of it again. People who were affected by what was inside, but moved on, just like me, never acknowledging the true horror of it all. There's something unsettling in the silence, in the way we all pretend that it didn't happen, that nothing strange ever occurred. And maybe that's the scariest part, the fact that we are all complicit in pretending that nothing out of the ordinary happened when, deep down, we all know it did. I used to think the worst part of my experience was the night Grayson had become something else, that moment when he stood in front of me, no longer human, no longer the friend I had known. But looking back now, with years of distance between me and that night, I realized that the true horror wasn't just the transformation or the whispers or the cold shadows lurking in that house. It was the realization that something far more sinister was at play. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive in its own way, feeding on whatever it could get from those who ventured too close. It had a hunger that seemed to draw people in, only to twist them into something unrecognizable. And that's the part that still haunts me. The thought that there are places in this world that we can never truly understand, places that hide their true nature behind a mask of normalcy, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. We like to think we know the world around us, that we can control it, but sometimes we're just lucky enough to escape from the things we don't understand. In the end, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't run, if I had stayed to confront whatever it was that Grayson had become. Would I have been the next one taken? Or would I have joined him in that twisted existence? Would I have been able to resist the pull of the house, or would it have claimed me too, just like it had claimed so many before? I never have answers, only questions. I can never forget what happened that night, but I also know I can never go back. I've told myself over and over that the house is just a memory, that I'm free from it. But the whispers, they never stop. I hear them sometimes in the dead of night, when the world is still and quiet, and it feels like someone or something is watching me. But I refuse to go back. I refuse to let that darkness swallow me whole. Maybe that's why, to this day, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still running. That night, that house, and whatever it was that Grayson became, it hasn't truly let me go. It's like an itch in the back of my mind, a persistent thought that lingers when I least expect it. And I know deep down that the next time I hear those whispers, they might not just be memories. They might be something more. But for now, I carry on. I live my life, keeping my distance from the things I can't control, from the places I can't understand. And I wait. I wait for the day when those whispers grow louder, when they reach out and drag me back into the darkness I tried to escape from. And if that day ever comes, I don't know if I'll be able to run again. It was the kind of summer afternoon that felt like it would stretch on forever. The kind of day that made you want to forget about the ticking clock, close your eyes, and let the world continue without you. The sun had set behind the hills of the small town where I grew up, casting a warm golden way over everything. I had just finished my shift at the local hardware store, my fingers sore from the day's labor. The only thing I wanted to do was relax and escape the mundane routine of my daily life. I lived in a quiet, somewhat isolated town where everyone knew everyone, and the most exciting event was the annual county fair. But for all its peace, the town had its secrets. Not that people talked about them much. In fact, most of the time, people preferred to leave certain things buried and forgotten. One of those things was the old amusement park on the edge of town. It had been shut down for years, and most of us had long since lost interest in it. Still, there were rumors, whispers that you could never quite shake off. Stories of odd occurrences, strange lights, and unsettling sounds drifting through the woods at night. You've heard these stories before, hauntings that linger even after the buildings fall into disrepair. I didn't pay much attention to those rumors. To me, they were nothing more than stories to tell around a campfire, a way to make a dull evening interesting. But everything changed the day I decided to visit the park. It was a lazy Friday afternoon when I met up with a couple of old friends, Lucas and Anna. We had known each other for years, but in recent times, we hadn't hung out much. Life had a way of doing that to people. Anna had always been the more adventurous one of the group, and Lucas, well, he was the skeptic. He never liked getting involved in anything that didn't make sense to him. But this time, he didn't argue when Anna suggested we visit the amusement park. In fact, he seemed strangely quiet, like he was in on some kind of secret that the rest of us were left in the dark about. "I heard something strange about that place," Anna said as we walked through the dusty streets, the air heavy with the scent of summer heat. "Some people say it's haunted, that the rides aren't just old, they're cursed." "Haunted?" Lucas scoffed. "Come on, Anna, it's just a rundown park. People get bored and make up stories. You know how it goes." I was inclined to agree with Lucas. There had to be some kind of rational explanation for all those tales. I mean, sure, the park had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, but that didn't mean it was haunted. It was just a broken down, forgotten place that people had chosen to avoid. The rumors were probably just exaggerated stories meant to make the place seem more mysterious than it really was. But as we approached the park, something felt off. The air seemed heavier, charged with an unspoken energy that I couldn't quite place. The closer we got, the quieter the world around us became. Even the birds, which usually filled the air with their chirping, had gone silent. It was like the park had a way of sucking all the life out of the surroundings, leaving only an unsettling stillness in its wake. The park sat at the edge of a dense forest, the twisted iron gates standing slightly ajar, as though inviting us in. It was obvious that no one had bothered to maintain the place in years. Vines and ivy crawled up the rusted fences, and the signs that once advertised the park's attractions were now faded and barely legible. The old roller coaster loomed in the distance, its rusted tracks looking like a skeleton of something that had once been grand. "This place is a mess," Lucas muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I don't see why anyone would want to come here." "I don't know," Anna said, her voice trailing off. "There's something about it. I can feel it." As we stood there, looking at the abandoned park, it was hard to ignore the sense of something lurking just beyond our view. The old Ferris wheel creaked in the wind, and the carousel, once bright and full of life, stood still, its painted horses frozen in time. It was clear that the place had long since been forgotten by the world, but somehow the air around it felt thick, like the park itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. "Let's go in," Anna said, breaking the silence. She was the first to step toward the gate, her steps confident and sure. Lucas and I exchanged a glance, both of us unsure, but neither of us willing to back down. We followed Anna through the gate and onto the cracked pavement, each of us drawn in by the strange pull of the place. As we walked deeper into the park, the sound of our footsteps echoed off the empty rides, amplifying the eerie quiet that surrounded us. For the next hour, we explored the park. We wandered past old ticket booths, abandoned game stalls, and broken down rides. There was no sign of anyone else around, just the three of us in the park. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that made everything seem even more desolate. But then, as the light began to fade, we heard it. A soft, faint sound, barely audible over the wind. A tinkling, almost musical sound that seemed to come from the direction of the old carousel. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice low. But it wasn't fear that made it tremble. It was confusion. "Yeah," Lucas said, sounding a bit more uneasy than usual. "It came from over there." Anna was already walking toward the carousel. She didn't seem frightened. In fact, she seemed fascinated, as though she was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. Lucas and I exchanged another glance, and this time the unease was palpable. Neither of us wanted to admit it, but the air around us had changed. The sense of normalcy had evaporated, replaced by a strange heaviness that made our hearts beat faster. "Let's check it out," I said, trying to sound casual, though there was no mistaking the knot of fear that had begun to form in my stomach. We made our way toward the carousel, the faint sound growing louder the closer we got. As we approached, I saw the horses, frozen in mid-motion, their eyes staring into nothingness. The music, though soft, was unmistakably coming from the old carousel. There was something unsettling about it, something not quite right. The air was colder here, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. As I reached out to touch one of the horses, I could have sworn I felt something brush against my hand, something cold, like the presence of a ghost, lingering in the air. But when I looked, nothing was there. Lucas looked at me, his face pale. "We should leave." But before I could respond, the ground beneath us seemed to tremble. A low, distant rumble echoed through the park, and the music from the carousel grew louder, more distorted. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around. The park, once silent and still, now seemed alive in a way that was terrifying. "Anna," I said, my voice shaking. "It's time to go." But Anna didn't answer. She was standing next to the carousel, her eyes wide, staring at something in the distance. Something none of us could see. I reached out for her, but it was too late. Something in the air had shifted, and the park, it seemed, was not as empty as we had once thought. We stood there in stunned silence, the faint sound of the carousel music still ringing in our ears when it happened. At first, it was so subtle that we almost missed it. It wasn't anything you could immediately point to as strange. It was the kind of thing that only made sense in hindsight. A shift in the atmosphere, like the park itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. Anna, who had been standing next to the carousel, turned her head sharply, as though she had heard something. Her eyes darted toward the far corner of the park, where the old bumper cars sat in a forgotten heap. I watched her, unsure of what she was seeing. Lucas, too, had noticed the change in her demeanor. He stepped closer, squinting into the fading light. "Did you see that?" Anna's voice was soft, almost a whisper. There was a sudden edge to it, a tremor of something I couldn't quite place. She was clearly shaking. Lucas frowned. "See what?" Anna didn't answer at first. Her gaze remained locked on the bumper cars, her expression frozen in a way that made me uneasy. "Over there," she finally said, her voice barely above a murmur. I thought I saw someone. I glanced at the bumper cars, trying to make sense of what she was saying. The shadows were growing longer now, stretching across the park like dark fingers reaching out. The park was becoming more oppressive, the air heavy and thick with something we couldn't identify. There was no one there, just rusted metal and a few crumbling structures. It was the kind of place that felt abandoned, forgotten by time, and yet Anna's words hung in the air, refusing to dissipate. I stepped toward her, trying to calm her down. "It's probably just your imagination," I said, my voice sounding strangely hollow. "There's no one here. It's just the shadows playing tricks on you." But Anna shook her head. "I saw something," she insisted, her voice quivering. "A figure standing by the bumper cars. I swear it moved." Lucas was still squinting in that direction, clearly not convinced. "There's no one there, Anna. It's probably just some stray animal or something else. I don't know. The park is in pretty bad shape." But Anna didn't seem to hear him. She was already walking toward the bumper cars, her feet quickening with each step. She wasn't frightened, but her movements were urgent, as though something had compelled her to investigate. "Anna, wait," I called after her, my voice sharp now. "We should get out of here. This place feels wrong." But she didn't listen. She was too focused on whatever it was she thought she had seen. I glanced at Lucas, who stood a few paces behind me, still trying to make sense of the situation. His face was pale, but he wasn't making any move to stop her. I could see the skepticism in his eyes, the disbelief. We had come here for curiosity's sake, and now, it seemed, curiosity had led us into something we couldn't explain. Anna's footsteps crunched on the broken pavement as she neared the bumper cars. The old vehicles, with their peeling paint and shattered windows, looked like forgotten relics of a more cheerful time. They were arranged in a haphazard circle, the seats empty, and the metal supports rusted. The whole area had the eerie look of a forgotten place, frozen in time. I started walking after her, but Lucas grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Don't," he said, his voice low. "It's not worth it." But I couldn't stop myself. I had to make sure Anna was okay. Something about the look in her eyes, the intensity of her focus, unsettled me. I broke free of Lucas's grip and quickened my pace, catching up to Anna just as she reached the edge of the bumper car ring. "Anna, stop," I said, grabbing her shoulder. She didn't flinch. Her eyes were locked on something in the distance, her expression unreadable. I followed her gaze, but I didn't see anything. The space between the old cars was empty, save for a few broken bits of debris. But the longer I stared, the more it felt like there was something in that space, something moving just outside my line of sight. "Did you see it?" Anna asked, her voice trembling now. I shook my head, trying to steady my nerves. "No, Anna. There's nothing there." "Look," she insisted, her finger pointing toward the gap between the cars. Her hand trembled, and her body was tense, like a coiled spring. I squinted again, trying to see what she saw. And then, just as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground, I thought I saw something too. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure, just the outline of someone, standing behind the cars. But before I could make sense of it, the figure seemed to dissolve into the darkness, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. A chill ran down my spine. "Did you see that?" I whispered, more to myself than to Anna. The words barely left my mouth before I felt a sudden drop in temperature. It wasn't just the cooling air of the evening. It was something more. A frigid gust of wind that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And then there was the sound. At first, it was just a faint rustling, but then it grew louder, more distinct, like footsteps. Not from the ground, but from the air, like something unseen was moving just above us. I turned quickly, looking over my shoulder, expecting to see Lucas behind me, but he was nowhere to be found. "Lucas?" I called out, my voice now shaky. "Where are you?" Anna's eyes were wide with fear now, her breath quick and shallow. "Lucas?" There was no answer. I turned back toward the bumper cars, my heart racing. My gaze flicked back to the spot where we had last seen the figure, but now there was nothing. The area was empty. The eerie quiet had returned, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was the kind of silence that made you feel exposed, like you were being watched. Anna stepped back from the bumper cars, her face pale. I don't like this," she murmured, shaking her head. "This place isn't right. It's not just an old park. It's something else." I agreed with her, though I wasn't sure what it was. "We need to find Lucas," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He's gone." Anna nodded, her hands trembling as she looked around. Where could he have gone? He was right here a second ago. We began to search, calling out his name, but the park seemed to swallow our voices. There was no sign of Lucas anywhere. Not by the bumper cars, not near the carousel, not by the old ticket booth. That's when we heard it again. A sound, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the old Ferris wheel, that creaky, rusted monstrosity that had long since stopped turning. Footsteps. Not from us, but from somewhere else. We hurried toward the Ferris wheel, our footsteps muffled by the thickening layer of dust and debris that covered the old park pathways. The atmosphere around us had become heavier, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. It was like the park itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The faint creaking of the Ferris wheel grew louder as we approached, and with each step, the unease inside me deepened. It was as if the sound was getting closer, echoing off the abandoned stalls and structures that lined the park. The wheel, once the highlight of this place, now stood still in the darkness, a towering relic of a forgotten era. "Lucas?" I called again, my voice barely carrying over the wind that had begun to pick up. It was a strange wind, not the kind of breeze you'd expect on a warm night. It was cold, biting, and carried with it the scent of something decayed, like something that had been left too long to rot. There was still no answer, only the creaking of the Ferris wheel and the sound of our own breathing. Anna was beside me, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. Her hand was clutching mine tightly, as if trying to anchor herself in the midst of the growing chaos. "I don't like this," she whispered. Her voice trembled, and I couldn't help but feel the same. This place felt more and more wrong with every passing second. It was as though the air itself was thickening with something dark, something we couldn't see but could feel pressing down on us. As we reached the base of the Ferris wheel, we saw it movement in the distance. A shadow darted across the path, too fast for us to make out what it was, but it was unmistakably there. I froze, staring into the dark, heart pounding. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind nothing but the sound of our ragged breathing and the eerie creaking of the Ferris wheel. "Did you see that?" Anna gasped, her grip tightening on my hand. "Was that Lucas?" I shook my head, unwilling to voice the fear that had settled deep in my chest. It couldn't be Lucas. He hadn't looked like that. The shadow had moved too quickly, and there was something off about the way it moved, like it wasn't entirely part of the world we knew. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was probably an animal, a stray cat or a raccoon, something that had found its way into the park. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Nothing here felt natural anymore. "I don't think it was," I said, my voice low, almost as if speaking any louder would disturb whatever was hiding in the shadows. "We need to find him. Now." We moved forward again, creeping through the dilapidated park with an unsettling sense of urgency. The Ferris wheel loomed over us, its rusted frame creaking under the pressure of the wind. It felt like the entire structure was groaning in protest, as if it was about to collapse, but it didn't. It just stood there, motionless, watching us. Then, suddenly, I heard it a soft whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place. Anna must have heard it too, because she stiffened beside me, her eyes wide as she scanned the surrounding darkness. "What was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard. "I don't know." We continued moving, slower now, trying to stay as quiet as possible. But the whispering, whatever it was, grew louder, clearer. It wasn't words, not exactly. It was more like a series of unintelligible sounds, low and melodic, as if someone or something was humming. It was coming from somewhere near the old ticket booth, just up ahead. I glanced at Anna, whose face was drawn in fear, her eyes flicking nervously toward the booth. Without saying anything, we both started toward it, drawn to the source of the noise, like moths to a flame. As we neared the ticket booth, the air grew colder, a biting chill that seemed to seep into my bones. The lights, what little remained, flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls. The faint scent of decay grew stronger, filling my nose, and I gagged at the stench. There was something foul about it, something that didn't belong. "I don't like this," Anna whispered again, her voice trembling. "I think we should leave." I wanted to agree with her. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to leave this place before whatever was here consumed us too. But I couldn't. I had to find Lucas. I had to know what was happening. It was as if something inside me had taken control, pulling me deeper into the park, despite the growing terror that gnawed at my insides. As we approached the ticket booth, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was even more oppressive than the noise had been. I stepped forward, my footfall echoing loudly in the empty space. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. Another shadow. This time, it was near the old concession stand, a dark shape moving swiftly behind the rusted frame of the booth. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice cracking. Anna nodded, but she didn't say anything. She just grabbed my arm, pulling me back as though she wanted to run. I could see the fear in her eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to leave, not yet. "Lucas!" I shouted, my voice carrying across the empty park. "Where are you?" A pause. Then, through the thickening shadows, I saw him. But it wasn't him. Not really. It looked like Lucas, but it wasn't. His posture was wrong, too stiff, too rigid. His head tilted unnaturally to one side, and his movements were jerky, like he was being controlled by some unseen force. I could barely make out his features in the dim light, but I knew that wasn't him. His eyes were wide, but there was no recognition in them. They were vacant, empty, staring at nothing. Anna gasped, pulling away from me. "That's not him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That's not Lucas." I nodded, my throat tight. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. All I could do was watch as the figure moved closer, its movements unnatural, almost mechanical. The closer it got, the more I realized it wasn't just the body that was wrong, it was everything about it. The way it walked, the way it didn't blink. It wasn't human anymore. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. The figure was almost upon us, and I could hear its breath now slow, steady, like the sound of someone breathing underwater. There was no sound of footsteps, just the breath. That constant, wet, gurgling sound that seemed to be coming from deep within the earth. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the darkness. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. What had just happened? Had I imagined it? No, there was no way. Anna was staring at the spot where the figure had been, her expression a mix of disbelief and terror. I don't know what that was," she whispered. Neither did I, but one thing was certain, whatever it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And we were just getting started. The silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The darkness had deepened, and the only sound that filled the space was the faint groan of the Ferris wheel as it shifted in the wind. It felt like the entire park was holding its breath, waiting for something we couldn't see but could feel closing in on us. Every muscle in my body was tense, my chest tight, as if the air itself was pressing down on me, suffocating me. Anna was shaking beside me, her grip on my arm almost painful. I could feel her fear radiating off her, a palpable presence that seemed to make the darkness even heavier. Neither of us spoke. There was no need to. We both knew what had happened. We'd seen it. The figure, the way it moved, the way it wasn't human. And yet, as we stood there, in the stillness of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the worst of it yet. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, but the air tasted wrong, like mold, old metal, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. The scent of decay was stronger now, clinging to everything around us. I glanced around the park, the shadows now seeming to move in ways that didn't make sense. They twisted and stretched unnaturally, following us as we moved, as if they were alive. "Lucas," I whispered, but the name felt hollow in my mouth. It was a name that had once meant something to me, but now it felt foreign, disconnected. The person who had once been my friend, my companion, was gone, replaced by something that wore his skin but had none of his soul. Whatever had happened to him, it wasn't something I could comprehend. It wasn't something anyone could comprehend. And then, without warning, the ground beneath our feet shifted. It wasn't much, just a subtle tremor, a slight vibration that made me pause and look around. But then it came again, stronger this time. The ground seemed to hum beneath me, as though something massive was moving beneath the earth, something ancient, something that had been waiting for us. I looked at Anna. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She didn't need to say anything. We both knew. It was here. Whatever it was. The humming grew louder, and the air thickened, vibrating with an unnatural energy. It felt as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to fray at the edges, unraveling in slow motion. The Ferris wheel groaned again, louder this time, as though it were being pulled by an invisible force. And then, as though the world couldn't take it anymore, the sky above us cracked open. At first, it was just a flicker, a brief flash of light, like lightning. But then it spread, slowly at first, like a crack in glass, splitting across the sky. The stars blinked out one by one, leaving only the fractured remnants of what had once been a peaceful night sky. The air grew colder, biting at my skin, and a deep, hollow noise filled the air, a sound like a distant, tortured wail, echoing from deep within the earth. Anna screamed, her hand pulling away from mine. I reached for her, but it was too late. She was already running. "Anna, wait!" I shouted, but the words felt useless, lost in the chaos that was unfolding around us. I turned to follow her, but the ground shook again, harder this time. The Ferris wheel, that rusted, lifeless structure, suddenly lurched forward with a loud metallic screech, as if coming to life. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I could hear Anna's footsteps fading into the distance, but there was something else now. Something following her. And then I saw it. The shadow. It wasn't like the one we had seen earlier. This one was bigger, darker, more solid. It towered over the abandoned stalls and rides, stretching impossibly high into the sky. It moved with purpose, its form shifting, writhing as if it were made of smoke, of darkness itself. And within that shadow, I could see shapes. Faces. Faint, distorted faces that seemed to twist in agony. They were screaming, but no sound came from them. Anna's screams echoed in the distance, growing more frantic with each passing second. "Anna!" I shouted, my voice breaking. But the shadow was already moving toward her, its twisted form closing in, faster than I could run. I had to stop it. I had to save her. I pushed myself forward, ignoring the burning in my legs, the panic rising in my chest. The ground trembled beneath me, the air thick with the oppressive weight of whatever was happening. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let her face that thing alone. I rounded the corner of the ticket booth, my heart in my throat, and there she was. Anna. Her back pressed against one of the old, rotting structures that had once been a part of the funhouse. She was panting, her eyes wide with terror, her hair wild in the wind. "Anna," I called, running toward her. But she wasn't looking at me. Her gaze was fixed on the shadow, the dark, shifting mass that was now inches away from her. "No," I screamed, my voice raw with fear. But it was too late. The shadow reached for her, its form twisting and stretching out like a hand, long fingers of darkness curling around her body. Her scream shattered the air, a sound that was both human and not. It was the sound of terror, of pure, unadulterated fear. And then, in an instant, she was gone. Vanished. There was nothing left. No trace. No body. Just the lingering echo of her scream and the silence that followed. I stood there, frozen in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. My mind couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Anna had been right there. I had seen her. And now she was gone. The shadow turned toward me, its empty eyes fixated on me. I could feel it pulling at me, drawing me into its depths. I could feel the cold, the darkness, creeping into my bones. But I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The Ferris wheel creaked once more, and the sky, which had once been torn apart, began to heal, the cracks slowly fading, the stars flickering back into existence. The air grew still again, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. But the damage had been done. Anna was gone, and I was left standing alone in the ruins of the park, with nothing but the remnants of whatever had taken her. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest, and I knew one thing for certain. This place wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it was waiting for more. And I had no idea if I would make it out alive. The quiet after Anna disappeared was deafening. It was as if the world itself had held its breath, waiting for the next horrifying moment to unfold. But there was no more sound, no more movement, just the cold, dead stillness of the abandoned amusement park, stretching out before me like a vast, desolate wasteland. I couldn't move at first. My legs felt like lead, my mind too numb to process what had just happened. 1 minute, Anna had been standing right beside me, her fear matching mine. and the next. She was gone. It was as though the darkness had swallowed her whole, leaving no trace behind. I had no answers, no explanation. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking as I tried to steady myself. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, a constant reminder that I was still alive, still trapped in this nightmare. The silence around me was suffocating, like the park itself was closing in. The dark shadows that had moved across the ground, the unnatural way the Ferris wheel groaned, the whispers of wind that had brushed past me, none of it made sense. I tried to wrap my mind around it, but it was impossible. There was no logic here. No reason. Only darkness. I turned and looked back toward the path that led out of the park, the entrance gate barely visible through the haze of night. I had to leave. I had to get out. But something inside me refused to move. Something kept me anchored here, as if the park was holding me in place, keeping me from escaping. The tension was unbearable. I couldn't stay here. Not without Anna. Not without understanding what had happened. I needed answers. I had to find them. But then, I heard a faint sound, barely audible, but distinct enough to make my blood run cold. Footsteps. I froze. My eyes darted around, searching for the source. But there was nothing. No figure. No shadow. Just the darkened paths of the park, stretching endlessly in all directions. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They sounded like they were coming from all directions at once, the rhythmic pounding of boots on gravel echoing in my mind. I was surrounded. My heart raced as I turned in circles, my breathing coming in quick, shallow gasps. My hand gripped the rusted railing of the old carousel, its chipped paint cold under my fingertips. I could feel the presence, the weight of something unseen, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I wasn't alone. Suddenly, the world around me seemed to shift. The park wasn't the same as it had been only moments before. It was darker, twisted, as if the very landscape had changed, had shifted into something far worse. The once welcoming paths now looked like mazes of stone and overgrown weeds, the rides decaying and warped, as though time had been cruel to them. And then, through the thick veil of fog that had rolled in, I saw a figure. It was standing at the far end of the park, barely visible, but enough for my eyes to latch onto it. The figure was tall, almost skeletal, draped in shadows that clung to it like a second skin. I couldn't make out its face, but I felt its eyes on me. Felt them pierce through me, like they could see the very core of who I was. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps had stopped, but I could still feel the weight of whatever was watching me. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I could hear the faint sound of something dragging behind me. I glanced over my shoulder quickly, expecting to see Anna, but there was nothing. Just the same dark, empty park stretching behind me. The figure moved, its body slithering forward like a serpent in the night. I wanted to run, but my legs were frozen, unwilling to cooperate. The closer it got, the more I could feel its presence, cold, suffocating, like a shadow that had slipped into my skin. It stopped just a few feet away, and for a long moment, we stood there, staring at one another. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. And then, the figure tilted its head, just slightly, as if it were studying me. It was then that I saw it, the faintest glint of light in its eyes, a deep, endless void that seemed to stretch out into the abyss. "I know what you seek," a voice whispered, though its source was impossible to identify. It came from everywhere at once, echoing in my ears, vibrating in my bones. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. The figure's presence was too much, too overwhelming, like it was seeping into my very soul. The air was colder now, biting at my skin, and I could feel my body shaking with fear. "Why?" I managed to rasp, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond right away. Instead, it took another step closer, its form shifting, growing darker, more oppressive. It loomed over me, its shadow stretching to engulf me entirely. "You were always meant to find this place," it said, its voice distant, cold. "The park. the darkness. It all leads to the same end. It was never about Anna. It was never about you. My breath caught in my throat. What do you mean? I asked, my voice trembling. What do you want? The figure's form flickered, distorting like a broken image on a TV screen. I want nothing, it said, almost in amusement. But you will never leave. Not now. Not ever. The words hit me like a blow, knocking the breath out of me. The fear in my chest grew, filling every corner of my mind. This wasn't just some ghost, some cursed park. This thing had always been here. It had been waiting for someone to come, for someone to wander into its domain. No, I whispered, the word barely audible as I took a step back. I need to get out. I have to get out. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand-long, bony fingers that reached toward me with unnatural speed. Before I could react, the world seemed to snap back into focus. The shadow shrank, the air grew lighter, and the overwhelming sense of dread lifted slightly. The figure was gone. The park, once again, seemed still. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the gravel, heart racing. My mind screamed at me to keep moving, to get out of this place before it consumed me completely. I didn't stop running until I reached the exit gate. But even then, I didn't feel safe. I looked back one last time, half expecting to see that thing waiting for me. But the park was silent, still, as if nothing had happened at all. And yet, as I stood there, panting, drenched in sweat, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly free. That something had followed me. That the park wasn't done with me yet. But for now, I was alive. And that had to be enough. The truth remained unanswered. There would be no resolution, no way to understand what had truly happened. I didn't know if anyone would ever believe me, if anyone would ever learn the terrible secret of that place. But I knew one thing for certain. I would never return. I would never step foot inside that park again. And yet, even as I walked away, I could feel its eyes on me, following me, waiting. As I stood at the park's exit, the heavy gate creaking slightly in the wind, I realized I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if the night itself had come alive, still alive with the echoes of things I couldn't explain. The further I walked away, the more I wanted to convince myself that it was over, that I had escaped. But the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I glanced over my shoulder one last time, half expecting to see that figure standing in the darkness, its hollow eyes fixated on me. But there was nothing, only the distant glow of streetlights at the edge of the park and the faint outline of trees swaying in the breeze. I had survived. I had made it out. But did I really? I couldn't help but wonder if the park was still out there, waiting for the next curious soul to wander in, the next unfortunate wanderer to fall victim to whatever curse it held. The park had a way of drawing people in, whether they realized it or not. It was an itch in the back of your mind, a subtle pull on your instincts. And once you were inside, it had a way of swallowing you whole. Anna was gone. I never saw her again. I couldn't bring myself to go back, not even for closure. And the thought of trying to search for her in the heart of that cursed place was unbearable. I wasn't sure if she had truly disappeared, if something had taken her, or if she had become part of the darkness herself. I tried to move on with my life, to forget about the horrors that had unfolded in that decaying amusement park. I moved to a new city, far away from that place. I surrounded myself with distractions, new jobs, new people, but there were nights when the wind howled a little too fiercely or the sky was unusually dark, when I would find myself thinking about it again. That part. The twisted, broken rides, the shadowy figure, the whispers, the footsteps. But the thing that haunted me the most was the knowledge that it was never truly over. No matter how far I ran, that part would always be there, lurking in the back of my mind. I couldn't erase it. In my dreams, I would sometimes hear that voice again, the same whisper that had echoed through my bones when I had faced the figure. You will never leave. Not now. Not ever. What did it mean? What had the figure meant when it said that? I couldn't let go of the fear that perhaps it was true, that I hadn't escaped after all. Some nights, when the wind would rattle my windows just the right way, or when I'd pass an old, abandoned building, I would feel a chill crawl up my spine. I'd feel an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, as if I were back there again. Back at the park, staring into the darkness, feeling the cold eyes watching me from the shadows. The sensation was always fleeting, but enough to make my heart race and my skin crawl. I tried to dismiss it, to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the trauma of that night was still lingering. But deep down, I knew better. Deep down, I feared that the park hadn't let me go. Maybe it was never going to let me go. Weeks passed, then months. My life moved forward, and I tried my best to live without looking over my shoulder. But one evening, after a long day at work, I came home to find an envelope on my doorstep. It was old-fashioned, the kind of paper that felt like it had been sitting in the back of a drawer for years. There was no return address, no markings, nothing to indicate who had sent it, just my name, written in dark ink on the front. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me, and I tore it open. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of the amusement park, the very same one. But it wasn't just the park. In the center of the image was a figure tall, thin, and completely shrouded in darkness. Its face was obscured, but the shape of it was unmistakable. The same figure I had seen that night. The same thing that had watched me, that had taunted me with its cold voice. I dropped the photo, my hand shaking. It fluttered to the ground like a dead leaf, and I stared at it in disbelief. My heart hammered in my chest as my mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How? How did they know? I grabbed the photo and looked closer. There was something written on the back in a shaky hand. It's not over. I couldn't breathe. The world tilted beneath me, and for a moment, everything felt surreal. My mind screamed at me to forget it, to burn the photograph, and forget the park. But I couldn't. I couldn't escape it. I realized then, with a terrifying certainty, that the park had always been with me. It had never let me go, no matter how far I ran. It was in my thoughts, in my nightmares, in the very air I breathed. And now, it had come for me again. There would be no peace. There would be no escape. No matter how much time passed, no matter how many places I moved to, the park would always find me. It would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next chance to pull me back in. I burned the photograph, just as I had burned the memories, but deep inside, I knew it wouldn't be the last time it came for me. I had been marked. We all are, once we've crossed that threshold. The park had claimed me, body and soul, and there was no getting out. The chilling thought kept me awake at night. There's nowhere left to run. And so, the story ends not with an answer, but with a question that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Who or what else has the park claimed since that night? And how many more will it claim before it's done? All I can do is wait. Wait for the next sign, the next call. The darkness never truly goes away, and it will always find its way back to me. It was an ordinary day, at least at first. The kind of day that seemed to have no edge, no drama, just routine. I had just finished a long shift at the office, one of those 9-to-5 jobs that felt like they were eating away at the soul. The clock had finally hit the end of my shift, and I was more than ready to get out of there. There was no particular rush to be anywhere. The streets were just starting to quiet down as the sun began to dip below the horizon. I had always been the kind of person who appreciated a bit of quiet after a busy day. So, rather than taking the main road home, which was always crowded with traffic, I decided to take a shortcut through the woods just outside town. It wasn't the most conventional route, but it was a path I had taken countless times before. It was familiar, and it offered a bit of peace amidst the chaos of everyday life. The trees in that forest felt like old friends, offering comfort with their thick trunks and rustling leaves. The road that led to the forest was a small, narrow street that split off from the main highway, cutting through a stretch of wooded land. I'd driven down it enough times to know every twist and turn, and even though it wasn't exactly well lit, I never felt unsafe. The forest wasn't vast, just a small patch of land, really, but it held a peculiar sense of stillness that made it seem larger than it was. The path was mostly dirt, with only the occasional patch of overgrown grass daring to push through the cracks. I remember feeling the exhaustion in my bones as I started my drive down that familiar road. The car's engine hummed steadily beneath me, and for the most part, everything felt normal. There was something soothing about the emptiness of the road, something that made the world outside seem a little less chaotic. The forest itself had always been a place that I associated with simplicity, nothing complicated. It was just trees and silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. For most people, this might seem a bit eerie, but to me, it was comforting. I'd lived in this town my whole life, and it felt like nothing could go wrong in a place I knew so well. The evening was cool, with a slight breeze that made the leaves shift gently in the trees. There was no real reason to expect anything out of the ordinary, and at that moment, everything felt like it would be just another evening. I wasn't alone on this trip either. My brother, Tom, had called me earlier in the day, just checking in as we often did. He and I were close, even though he was a few years younger than me. He was a bit more adventurous, always suggesting things I never really gave a second thought to. I remember his voice on the phone that afternoon, his light-hearted laugh carrying through the call, as he mentioned how I should take that shortcut if I wanted to avoid the traffic. He had done it countless times himself, after all. That was the kind of relationship we had, sharing small moments, small tips, even the mundane details of our daily lives. As I continued driving, I kept thinking back to that conversation. His words were almost a comfort, the kind of reassurance that comes from someone you trust. "You'll be fine," he'd said. "It's just a quick shortcut through the woods. Nothing to worry about." His voice had been casual, almost too casual. But, like I said, I didn't think much of it. I had taken that shortcut more times than I could count. The headlights of my car illuminated the path ahead as the trees seemed to close in around me. The deeper I drove into the woods, the quieter the world seemed. There was no longer the faint hum of traffic from the nearby highway, just the steady rhythm of my tires crunching over the dirt and gravel. The air inside the car felt cool, even though it was just the tail end of summer. I remember thinking how peaceful everything was, too peaceful, maybe. But it wasn't like I had any reason to feel uneasy. After all, I'd driven this road hundreds of times. There was nothing to fear. Or so I thought. At some point, I had reached a part of the forest where the trees seemed to grow in thicker clusters. The road became a little more uneven, the branches above my head creating a canopy that made the night feel even darker. I didn't mind. In fact, it only added to the charm of the place. I hadn't realized it yet, but something was shifting in the air. Something was subtly changing, though it would take a while for me to understand exactly what. But there was no going back now. I was already on the path, and it was too late to turn around. The feeling of being watched, or perhaps just the silence pressing in on me, hadn't yet settled in. It was just me and the road, surrounded by trees, in a forest that had always been nothing but a peaceful shortcut. That's how it felt. Safe, familiar, simple. I had just passed the point where the trees became thicker, their trunks like dark sentinels standing silently along the narrow road. I was halfway through the forest, and everything still seemed normal. The car's headlights illuminated the rough path ahead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out like fingers reaching for the unknown. Yet, as I continued driving, there was something that began to feel off. At first, it was subtle, a tiny detail that my mind almost dismissed as nothing. But the longer I drove, the more my senses seemed to sharpen, and the unease began to settle in. It started with a flicker of movement at the edge of the forest. I thought I had seen something or someone dart across the road in the distance. Just for a second, a flash of something dark, disappearing quickly into the underbrush. My foot instinctively pressed down on the brake, though I quickly released it, telling myself it was just a deer or some other animal. The forest was full of wildlife after all, and the thought of it didn't seem all that out of place. But as I kept driving, the feeling didn't quite go away. The air seemed to grow denser, and the quiet that surrounded me was no longer peaceful, but oppressive. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just tired, the long hours at work making me overly sensitive. I was probably just imagining things. It was easy to convince myself that it was all in my head, especially since I was so used to the solitude of the woods. But then, I heard something that made my heart race. It was a low, almost inaudible sound, but it was enough to make me stiffen in my seat. A rustling, not just the wind shifting through the leaves or the usual sounds of the forest. No, this was different. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I glanced toward the trees, trying to make sense of it. My gaze scanned the thick underbrush on either side of the road, but there was nothing, no animal, no sign of movement. I turned the volume of the radio up a little, trying to drown out the unsettling feeling that had settled over me. But that sound didn't go away. It continued, faint but persistent, like something or someone was moving just beyond my reach. My hand tightened on the steering wheel, and I pushed my foot a little harder on the gas. Maybe it was just the wind, I told myself again. But the wind didn't rustle in such a controlled, rhythmic manner. And then it happened. Out of nowhere, a loud bang echoed from somewhere off the road. The sound was so sharp and sudden that I jerked the steering wheel instinctively. My heart pounded in my chest, and I swerved slightly, my tires skidding over the loose gravel. It wasn't the kind of sound you'd expect in a forest, like a branch falling or an animal making noise. No, it sounded like something or someone had struck the side of my car. I slammed on the brakes, coming to a halt in the middle of the road. The engine sputtered as it slowed to a stop, and for a moment, I sat there in the sudden silence, breathing heavily. I stared out the windshield, my mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. I looked at the side mirrors, expecting to see something or someone behind me. But there was nothing. No figures lurking in the shadows, no signs of anything out of place. My eyes scanned the trees again, but they were as still as ever. There was no indication of anything unusual. Still, the sensation of being watched lingered, hanging thick in the air. I sat there for a moment, feeling a strange pressure building in my chest. My mind screamed at me to turn around and head back, but there was something about the forest that kept me in place, as if I was drawn to it against my will. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was just an animal, maybe a branch or a large rock that had fallen from a tree. I forced my hands to relax on the steering wheel and started to roll the window down slightly, hoping to hear more of the forest. The night air was cool against my skin, and I could just make out the faint rustling of leaves in the distance. But nothing else. No sounds of anything hitting my car, no strange movements in the woods. The forest was, once again, silent. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again, a flicker of movement, but this time it was much closer. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly turned my head, my eyes scanning the area. Nothing. I had seen it though. I was sure of it, a shadow. A figure moving swiftly behind a thick tree trunk, just far enough for me to lose track of it the moment I looked. I shifted uneasily in my seat, my pulse quickening. I reached for the keys in the ignition, my hand trembling as I started the car again, the engine roaring to life. As I put it in drive, my eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone I couldn't quite make out, standing behind me, watching. But there was no one there. The road was empty. Still, that feeling of being watched didn't dissipate. If anything, it grew stronger. As I drove forward again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't explain it. The rational part of me told me to just keep going, to reach the end of the road and get home. But my instincts, that primal part of me, was telling me to turn back, to get out of there before it was too late. And then, just as I was about to put more distance between myself and the feeling of unease, I heard it. The distinct sound of footsteps, not behind me, but beside the car. The sound was so close that I thought I could feel the vibrations beneath me. I gripped the steering wheel harder, my knuckles white. and I looked out the window once more, hoping that it was nothing. But there, just a few feet away from the car, was a figure. It was difficult to make out, but I could see enough tall, thin, and impossibly still. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the headlights shining directly on it. It just stood there, looking at me. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing, and the figure suddenly vanished into the trees as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't wait to process what I had just seen. I put the car in reverse, spinning the wheel wildly as I backed up, desperate to get away from whatever that thing was. In the rearview mirror, I saw the trees empty. There was no sign of the figure, nothing at all. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. It was real. My hands were shaking as I pushed the gas pedal again, speeding down the road. The forest seemed to close in around me as I sped past, my eyes darting between the trees, half expecting to see something or someone watching me from the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake, and the worst part? I was still deep within the forest, and now it felt like the woods themselves were alive, aware of my presence. The further I drove, the more intense the feeling became. What had started as a strange encounter, something fleeting, almost dismissible, was now becoming undeniable. There was something in the woods with me. I could feel it. The air had thickened, almost as if the trees themselves were closing in, their dark branches leaning toward me like silent observers. The wind had died down completely, leaving only the sounds of my tires crunching over the gravel road and my erratic heartbeat. I drove faster, my eyes scanning the sides of the road for any sign of movement, for anything that might explain the tension in the air. The headlights sliced through the night, illuminating only a few feet in front of me, leaving the rest of the forest cloaked in inky darkness. The silence around me was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the car's suspension as it bounced over the uneven road. But then again, I heard it, the faint rustling, too deliberate to be the wind. The sound was growing closer. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I turned the corner, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the shadows, just behind the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone, swallowed by the night. I told myself it was just my nerves. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in the woods at night, I thought. The longer I drove, the more I convinced myself that whatever I thought I saw was just my imagination running wild. But then the strange sounds started again. This time, they were different, closer, more persistent. The rustling was followed by a sharp, sudden noise, like something or someone scraping against the car. My heart jumped into my throat, and I slammed on the brakes, screeching to a halt. The headlights flickered, casting a momentary shadow across the road, and for a split second, I thought I saw something dart across the path ahead of me. My pulse raced as I quickly looked around. There was nothing there. Nothing at all. I rolled down the window slightly, my breath visible in the chill air. The night felt unnaturally still now. The rustling had stopped. The only sound left was the pounding of my own heart and the soft chirp of distant crickets. I held my breath, straining my ears, hoping for any sign of movement, anything to explain the terrifying feeling creeping up my spine. Then I heard it again. This time, it was unmistakable, a low scraping sound, like fingernails against glass, dragging along the side of the car. I froze, my mind racing, struggling to comprehend what was happening. I quickly glanced in the side mirror. The reflection showed nothing. The road behind me was dark and empty, the headlights illuminating nothing but the vast stretch of trees and thick underbrush. But the sound kept coming slowly, methodically, moving along the side of the car, as if someone or something was running its fingers along the metal. I couldn't take it anymore. The terror was growing inside me, gnawing at my every thought. What if I wasn't alone? What if whatever was out there wasn't just some animal, some figment of my imagination? I couldn't stay in this forest any longer, not with whatever this was still lurking around. I turned the key in the ignition, but the engine sputtered and died. A surge of panic flooded my chest. I tried again, but it wouldn't start. The car, as if in mockery, refused to move. The headlights dimmed, flickering and then cutting out entirely, plunging the car into complete darkness. I fumbled for my phone, hoping against hope that I might have enough signal to call for help, but there was nothing. The screen showed a single bar of service, but it never connected. I was trapped. As I sat there, the weight of the silence pressing down on me, I heard a new sound, this one unmistakably close. It was a faint thud, followed by a soft scraping sound, as if something was dragging across the ground. It was moving toward me, slowly but steadily. My breath caught in my throat as the thuds grew louder. I glanced out the window to the forest just beyond the car. The night was still, but there was something now, something that didn't belong. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. And then, in the distance, I saw a flicker of movement. The outline of something or someone moving between the trees. It was too fast for me to make out clearly, but it was there, just beyond the range of my sight. The figure darted behind a tree, disappearing from view. I couldn't tell if it was a person or something else entirely, but I knew one thing for sure was not supposed to be there. I jumped out of the car, my heart pounding in my chest, a surge of adrenaline flooding my system. I had to get out of here. I needed to find a way to get the car started and get the hell away from whatever was in the forest with me. I moved around the car to the front, hoping the headlights would give me some clarity. But the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift unnaturally as I stepped into the forest's edge. The path was muddy, slick with the moisture that had built up from a long night of fall. As I crouched to check the engine, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a flash of pale skin, the faintest outline of something or someone moving just beyond the trees. I stood up, my body stiff with fear. I wasn't imagining this. Someone or something was out there. With shaky hands, I pulled open the hood of the car, trying to focus on anything other than the growing sense of dread. But just as I was about to examine the engine, I heard its footsteps. The unmistakable crunch of twigs and leaves, heavy and deliberate, moving toward me from behind. I froze. My blood ran cold, and I slowly turned my head, every muscle in my body locking into place. There, in the darkness, just past the car, I saw it again, shadows shifting, moving with an eerie precision. But this time, it wasn't just one figure. There were two. No, three. I couldn't make them out clearly, but they were there, moving slowly toward me, their steps synchronized, unnatural. I backed away, stumbling slightly as the fear started to take over my body. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. I had to get back in the car. I had to get out of there. But before I could turn, I heard another noise, a scraping sound, louder this time, closer. A shadow loomed just beyond the car, blocking out the faint light of the stars. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far for a human body. Its eyes, if you could even call them, that reflected no light, just empty darkness. I couldn't breathe. The figure tilted its head, and in that moment, I realized that whatever I had encountered in the woods was not of this world. The creature loomed in front of me, blocking my path with its immense form. My pulse hammered in my ears, louder than anything else, drowning out every other sound. I could feel my heart thrumming in my chest, the air thick with the weight of what was happening. I couldn't think, couldn't move. My mind was blank, my body frozen in terror as the figure before me took one deliberate step forward, its dark shape towering over me like a living nightmare. I tried to step back, but my legs wouldn't cooperate, my body unwilling to obey the most basic commands. My breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale shaky and panicked. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing before me, even though every fiber of my being screamed at me to look away. Its form was grotesque, inhuman, like something born from a nightmare that shouldn't exist. The long limbs stretched too far, the pale, featureless skin smooth yet unnatural. The shadowed face, a face that lacked any expression or defining features, stared at me with an emptiness that seemed to devour everything in its path. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I could feel the cold sweat gathering on the back of my neck, my fingers trembling as I reached for my phone, desperate for a signal, for something to make this nightmare end. But the screen remained black, as if mocking me. My phone was useless, just like everything else in this place. I was completely alone, with no way out. The creature stepped closer, its movements slow, almost deliberate, as though savoring my fear. Each footstep seemed to echo louder than the last, filling the air with a deep, resonant thud that shook the ground beneath my feet. I couldn't look away, my gaze locked on the monstrous figure as it closed in, its presence suffocating. The darkness of the woods seemed to close in tighter, as though the trees themselves were inching closer, pushing me into the arms of whatever this thing was. "Please," I managed to croak, my voice trembling as I tried to find the words to make it stop. But nothing came. No voice, no sound, just the oppressive silence that hung between us like a thick fog. And then it tilted its head, as if considering me. The motion was unnatural, fluid in a way that defied human logic, like watching a puppet on strings. Only the strings weren't there. Its black, empty eyes never left mine, and a cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized that it was studying me, analyzing me. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body was still frozen, my feet rooted to the ground as the terror paralyzed me. I could feel my knees buckling, my legs weak and unsteady. My mind screamed for me to act, to do anything to get away, but I was helpless. Then, without warning, the creature reached out. Its long fingers, impossibly thin and elongated, hovered just inches from my face. The touch was ice cold, but instead of physical pain, I felt something much worse, a deep, gnawing emptiness creeping into my chest, seeping into my soul. The sensation was unlike anything I had ever felt before, a coldness that seemed to touch the very core of my being, threatening to swallow me whole. I gasped, my body jerking back, but I couldn't escape. The thing's grip was no longer just physical. It was inside me, tugging at my very essence, pulling at my thoughts, my memories, and my will to survive. I felt as though I was being torn apart from the inside out, as if my very soul was being unraveled by the cold fingers of this monstrosity. My body trembled uncontrollably as it leaned in closer, its face still an unreadable void. The coldness grew, pressing down on me with such force that I could barely breathe. I could hear my heartbeat, slow and erratic, the sound echoing in my skull. I couldn't look away, couldn't close my eyes, no matter how desperately I wanted to escape the reality that was unfolding before me. The creature's breath, if you could even call it breath, was a hollow rasp, a sound that felt unnatural, like wind through an empty cavern. It didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but the pressure in the air around me was suffocating, thick with unspoken words, with some unseen force that seemed to press in from every direction. I tried to push it away, to scream, but nothing came. My mouth opened, but the sound was trapped inside me, as if my voice had been stolen. My body was no longer my own, my movements sluggish and weak, as if my very will to live was being drained by this entity before me. And then, in the depths of the creature's hollow gaze, something changed. The emptiness, the darkness, began to shift. For the first time, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. A flicker of recognition, a twisted reflection of myself, staring back at me through the creature's eyes. It was as though it was feeding on me, taking pieces of who I was, turning my own reflection into something unrecognizable. In that instant, I realized the horrifying truth. This thing wasn't just a creature of the woods. It wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was something far worse. It was a parasite, feeding on fear, on memories, on the essence of whoever crossed its path. And now, it was feeding on me. I tried to pull away, to break free from its hold, but it was like trying to fight against an invisible force. My mind screamed for me to run, to do something, anything, but my body refused to listen. I could feel the coldness seeping deeper, draining me of my strength, of my very sense of self. But then, in that moment of utter helplessness, a strange thing happened. The creature's grip faltered. It recoiled, just slightly, as if something had disturbed its hold on me. I seized the opportunity, stumbling back, my legs finally obeying, and I ran. My legs burned as I pushed myself forward, adrenaline kicking in, but the fear never left. The creature's eyes were still on me, its presence looming just beyond the trees, a constant reminder that I was not safe. I didn't stop running. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away from whatever that thing was, whatever it had done to me. The woods around me seemed to shift, to bend, as if the very forest itself was complicit in this horror. The trees reached out, their branches like skeletal hands, brushing against my skin as I sprinted through the darkness. My heart raced, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stumbled, tripping over rocks and roots in my desperate flight. I couldn't hear the creature anymore, couldn't feel its presence behind me, but I knew it was still there, still watching, still waiting. Eventually, I made it to a clearing. The moonlight broke through the thick canopy above, casting pale light on the ground. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my chest heaving. I looked around frantically, my eyes scanning the shadows, waiting for the next movement, for the next sign of the thing that had almost consumed me. But there was nothing. The woods were silent. The creature was gone. At that moment, I realized that it wasn't over. Whatever it was, it hadn't finished with me. It was still out there, waiting for the next time I let my guard down, waiting for the next moment when I'd wandered too far off the beaten path. And when that time came, I knew I wouldn't be so lucky again. The oppressive silence in the clearing was deafening. My breaths came in ragged, shaky gasps as I knelt on the ground, trying to steady myself, but nothing felt steady anymore. My legs trembled, my hands were still numb from the creature's touch, and my mind raced to make sense of the horror I had just survived. The feeling of its presence was still with me, like a cold shadow lingering just behind me. I couldn't escape the thought that I hadn't truly escaped. It was only waiting for the next moment of weakness, the next time I stepped into its domain. I didn't know how much time had passed when I finally managed to get to my feet. The adrenaline that had once fueled my escape had begun to wane, leaving me exhausted, disoriented, and afraid to look back. Every rustle in the underbrush, every movement in the corner of my vision sent me into a panic. I felt like I was being hunted, even though I couldn't hear anything chasing me. It was as though the forest itself had become a living thing, pressing in on me from all sides, reminding me that no matter how fast I ran, I wasn't safe. I knew I needed to leave, needed to find a way out of these woods before whatever it was found me again. But the path, the one I had once thought would lead me back to safety, was now just an endless maze of trees and shadows. The way I had come no longer made sense. The forest felt different, wrong. The trees looked like twisted silhouettes against the faint light of the moon, their branches reaching for me like skeletal hands, and I knew deep down that I couldn't trust my sense of direction anymore. How had I gotten so far off course? Had I wandered deeper than I realized? The question gnawed at me, but the fear of looking back at the forest's edge overpowered my need to figure it out. Instead, I forced myself to push forward, keeping my eyes trained on the faintest slivers of light coming from the horizon. I had to find my way out. I had to get back to civilization. Hours passed as I stumbled through the underbrush, my legs growing heavier, my thoughts muddled. The weight of what had happened pressed down on me. It didn't make sense. That thing, that creature, it had been real. I had felt its touch, its icy presence seeping into my soul, and I knew I hadn't imagined it. It was something more than just a shadow, something far older and more malevolent than I could ever understand. But what was it? And why had it come after me? What did it want? I didn't have answers. I had no closure, no explanation. I only had the fear, the dread that something far worse still awaited me. And that feeling of being watched, it never left. By the time I emerged from the trees, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. The forest behind me felt like a different world, an alien landscape that I could never truly leave behind. But the village lay ahead, just beyond the tree line. The sight of it, the promise of safety, brought a wave of relief that I had never felt before. I was so close to freedom, to being able to forget this nightmare. But the moment I crossed the threshold into the village, the feeling didn't disappear. The fear didn't lift. The people around me didn't notice. They didn't see the way I flinched at every sudden sound, every crackle of branches in the wind. They didn't know what I had seen, what had followed me. The weight of the experience stayed with me, a constant presence that no one else could understand. My escape had been physical, but the horror, the trauma, would never leave my mind. I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, those empty, dark eyes that seemed to haunt me, even in the safety of the village. As the days passed, I tried to return to my normal life. I went back to my routine, to the things I once found comfort in. But nothing felt the same. I no longer trusted the woods, no longer trusted the places I once roamed freely. The creature, or whatever it had been, had changed something inside me. It had left its mark on my soul, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the terror I had felt. I spoke to no one about what happened. Who would believe me? Who could? The villagers would only dismiss it as a bad dream or some hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But I knew the truth. I knew what I had felt, what had chased me, and what I had barely escaped. That thing was real. It was out there, and it would come again when the time was right. But for now, I could only wait. I would never go back into the forest. I would never take a shortcut again, not even if the path seemed clear. Because I knew the truth now. The forest, the trees, the earth beneath my feet, it was all a part of it. It wasn't just the creature. It was the entire place, a land steeped in darkness, alive with an ancient malevolence that would claim anyone foolish enough to wander too far. It would wait, bide its time, and when you least expected it, it would strike again. And no matter how many years passed, I knew that I would never truly be safe. The creature, the terror, would always be there, lurking in the shadows of my mind, waiting to return. As I looked out over the village from my window one night, the distant trees in the horizon seemed to shift. Or was it just the winds? It didn't matter. I couldn't let myself wonder. I had to stay away. I had to stay safe. But in the back of my mind, I knew the forest would always be there, just beyond the edge of the world I knew, waiting. It has been years since I left the village, and yet the memories remain vivid, as if it happened only yesterday. The days have passed, seasons have changed, and life has tried to move on. But there are things that stay with you, haunting you in ways that words can't fully express. I wish I could tell you that the terror of that night has faded, that time has healed my mind and heart. But the truth is, it hasn't. It never will. There are nights when I wake in a cold sweat, my breath caught in my throat, and for a split second, I am back in that forest, running, feeling the ground tremble beneath my feet, hearing the crack of branches, the whisper of something ancient and terrifying following my every step. And no matter how hard I try to shake it off, the feeling lingers, an echo of the creature's presence, of the forest's malevolence, a reminder that what I experienced was real. I never spoke about it to anyone after I left the village. How could I? How could I explain something so impossible, so terrifying, to people who had never felt the ground shift beneath their feet, who had never seen the trees move in ways they weren't supposed to? No one would believe me. No one would understand. The few people I did speak to about it, those who had lived through the years of my time in the woods, only shrugged it off as a bad experience or an overactive imagination. But I knew what I had faced, and I knew that I wasn't the first to face it, nor would I be the last. The village had its secrets, things unsaid, and the elders, those who had lived in that place their entire lives, carried a weight I couldn't begin to understand. They didn't speak of the forest. They didn't speak of the creature. But I saw it in their eyes when they looked out towards the trees, the way their faces tightened at the mention of the woods, and the way their stories, though seemingly harmless always, skirted too close to the edge of the truth. I saw the fear in them, and I realized that I wasn't just an isolated case. The forest had taken others before me, and it would continue to take more. I tried to leave it behind. I tried to live a life beyond the fear, to push the memories to the back of my mind where they belong. I built a new life, a quieter one, far from the village and the forest that haunted me. I took comfort in the mundane things, in the things that filled my days with normalcy, work, friendships, even a fleeting sense of peace. But every so often, I find myself looking over my shoulder, convinced I can feel the weight of eyes on me, the flicker of movement in the corner of my vision. And sometimes, when I walk through forests, the air grows heavy, the trees seem to crowd in, and I hear things, small, subtle sounds, like footsteps trailing behind me, branches snapping just out of view. And then I remember. I remember the feeling of being hunted. I remember the creature's eyes, those cold, dark voids that seemed to pierce through me, reading my soul like a book. I remember the way it moved, so effortlessly, so silently, as if it was part of the earth itself. I remember the way the air thickened, the oppressive silence that followed, the way the forest itself seemed to shift, becoming something alien, something alive in ways that defied reason. I remember the panic, the helplessness, the overwhelming sense that I was trapped, that no matter how far I ran, there was nowhere safe. Some nights, I wake to the sound of leaves rustling, and I can almost feel it there, just beyond the reach of the shadows, waiting. But I never turn around. I never look back. I know better now. I know that to look back is to invite it in, to let it find me again. And so, I keep moving forward, keeping my eyes straight ahead, my thoughts focused on the path ahead. Because in that forest, in those woods, you don't get to choose what follows you. It doesn't care about your past, your regrets, your fears. It only cares about one thing, you. In the years that followed, I tried to warn others. I tried to tell them what happened, what I saw, but no one listened. I've grown accustomed to the disbelief, to the mocking looks, to the casual dismissal of something so horrifying. I learned that people don't like to face the darkness that hides just beyond their doorsteps. They don't want to confront the fact that there are things in this world, in the shadows of the trees, that we are not meant to understand. The truth is too much for most to handle, and so they bury it, pack it away with all the other mysteries that cannot be solved. But I know the truth, and I carry it with me every day. That creature, whatever it was, whatever it still is, it lives on in the very heart of the forest. And though I have fled from its reach, though I have tried to leave it behind, I know that I am never truly safe. I've seen it, felt it, and it will never forget. There is something ancient in those woods, something older than any of us. It's patient, waiting for the right moment. And one day, it will find someone else who dares to take a shortcut through the trees, someone else who thinks the forest is nothing but an innocent stretch of nature. And when that happens, it will not be a story. It will not be something for others to dismiss or laugh at. It will be real. It will be the very thing that haunts their dreams, the very thing that follows them when they leave the woods, the thing that waits for them just beyond the edge of the light. But for now, I remain here. I remain haunted by the woods, by the creature, by the memories that never fade. And as I sit here, writing this, I can feel it again, the weight of those eyes, the coldness that lingers in my soul. I can hear the trees moving, the faintest rustle of something just beyond the veil of the ordinary world. And I know that, somewhere out there, the forest waits.